Hey guys, tonight we're going back, way back, to a time of longboats, longhouses, and even longer winters. We're cracking open the furs and peeling back the thatch roof on Viking society to talk about something historians rarely linger on. Love, sex, and everything squirmy that happened behind and very often not behind closed doors. This isn't a romanticized saga, no heroic heart playing here. It's the raw, cold truth about what happened when passion met practicality in a world of iron and ice. And spoiler alert, you probably won't survive this. Not emotionally, not culturally, and certainly not if you're squeamish about goats being part of marriage negotiations. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. I'm not here to beg, just vibe with me, and while you're at it, drop your city and the current time in the comments, because I want to know where in the world you're half asleep while learning about 9th century Viking bedroom arrangements. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You step inside a Viking longhouse. It smells like wood smoke, wet wool, sweat, and something vaguely sour that might be soup or might be feet. This isn't a home in the modern sense. It's a communal structure, shared by extended family, farmhands, and often animals. The fire pit glows in the centre, casting flickering shadows across low-hanging beams and woven wall hangings. You can hear every whisper, every creaking floorboard, every snore. Now imagine trying to have a private romantic moment in this space. Yeah, good luck with that. Love, in the way we understand it, didn't really have much room to bloom here. This wasn't the age of privacy. There were no cosy couples' nooks, no locked bedrooms, and certainly no do not disturb signs hanging on curtain rods. The average Viking home was open plan, lived in, and deeply utilitarian. If two people wanted intimacy, they did it quietly, discreetly, or boldly if they were feeling risky, and everyone pretended not to notice. The bed? If you were lucky, it was a carved wooden frame with straw-filled mattresses and some furs. If you weren't lucky or weren't high status, you made do on benches or in sleeping alcoves divided by hanging fabric. Privacy was performative. You could maybe draw a curtain, but the sound of laughter, livestock, and someone chopping turnips 10 feet away would still pierce the veil. Sex wasn't something to hide. It was just a part of the rhythm of life, like brewing beer or butchering a hog. Still, this doesn't mean Vikings were cold or joyless in their connections. They weren't robots in fur cloaks. They laughed, flirted, argued, and got jealous. There are enough sagas and poetic scraps to suggest that emotions ran high and hearts got tangled. But love had to function in a culture that prioritized survival, legacy, and alliances. Feelings bowed to function, and the house, your literal living space, reflected that. Historically speaking, the average Viking longhouse was around 50 to 75 feet long, sometimes more depending on wealth. It had one main room, possibly a smaller space on either end for storage or privacy if the family was fancy. The central hearth was the lifeblood of the home, where people cooked, gathered, and told stories. Benches lined the walls, which doubled as sleeping and sitting areas. There were no real windows, just smoke holes and maybe a tiny skylight. You're always aware of other people. You sleep with one ear open, and yes, you definitely know if someone's getting frisky. The fringe fact here. In some Viking households, animals, like goats, chickens, and occasionally a cow or two, were brought indoors during cold months. So not only was intimacy communal, it may have occasionally involved a goat nibbling your tunic mid-act. Mood killer or peak rustic kink. That's between you and your gods. But here's where the scholars still scratch their beards. How did Vikings really feel about privacy and intimacy? Some argue that the concept of privacy simply didn't exist the way it does now. Personal space was a luxury, not a right. Others suggest that despite the cramped conditions, cultural norms kept people respectful. Quiet, discreet, and mindful of boundaries. There are even records in the sagas of people being insulted for being too loud or crude. So while the architecture didn't allow for solitude, the social fabric may have created invisible walls. You walk further through the smoky air. There's a couple seated by the fire, heads lean together, whispering. Their fingers brush. Someone behind them coughs, but no one says anything. That tiny pocket of connection, fleeting and fragile, feels more romantic than all the privacy money can buy. Maybe that's the point. Maybe love, real love, found a way even in the most unromantic architecture possible. But for most Vikings, That warm connection wasn't the starting point. Relationships began with contracts, negotiations, and alliances. Fathers and clan leaders talked terms, mothers made quiet suggestions, and daughters and sons, well, sometimes they got a say, sometimes they didn't. That brings us to what happens when love meets cold steel and family politics, which is where we're headed next. You're standing in a smoky meeting hall now, a different kind of Viking space, this one thick with tension, not just from the fire pit, but from the heavy air of negotiation. Two men are seated across from each other, drinking mead with polite hostility, while a third, the local law speaker, leans on his staff and tries to keep things civil. They're not negotiating trade or land, they're discussing marriage, not love, marriage. In Viking society, relationships didn't begin with candlelit glances or stolen kisses. They began with contracts, usually hammered out over hornfuls of ale and promises of livestock. This was matchmaking by axe, figuratively and occasionally literally. Love wasn't off the table, but it didn't get a seat at the negotiations either. Marriages were arrangements between families, designed to bind bloodlines, end feuds, or expand influence. You didn't marry who you wanted, you married who made sense. The bride, often a teenage girl, sometimes as young as 12 or 13. The groom, often older, sometimes much older. In theory, the girl's consent mattered. In practice, her father's say carried more weight. There's at least one saga where a bride-to-be is so upset she curses her entire wedding procession and throws a rune-marked rock at the groom's head. He marries her anyway. Romantic! And yet not every Viking woman was silent or sidelined. Some held firm opinions and wielded enough social capital to sway outcomes. Shield maidens, those semi-mythical warrior women, may or may not have existed in large numbers, but women who fought beside men did exist. And if a woman was wealthy or came from a powerful clan, her opinion could matter more than her father's. Some sagas tell of women choosing husbands, or outright refusing suitors. If a man pursued her too aggressively, she could publicly shame him. Social embarrassment in Viking culture was a brutal punishment. It stuck longer than a scar. But when those negotiations didn't work out, when the groom didn't wait for permission, or the families didn't agree, that's when the darker truth surfaced. Bride kidnapping wasn't uncommon. In fact, it was sometimes framed as a romantic gesture in the sagas, an eligible warrior taking the bride he wanted. Of course, that's if you read the story from the guy's perspective. From hers, it's a whole different tale. Historically, there's debate over how widespread these kidnappings were, and how often they were truly abductions versus staged elopements. In some cases, lovers used the pretense of kidnapping to escape restrictive families. In others, powerful men simply took what they wanted. The saga literature is vague, deliberately so, some scholars argue, because Viking society didn't always agree on what counted as honourable courtship versus outright theft. One chilling example comes from the Laxdæla saga, where a woman named Gudrun is promised to several men, married off, betrayed and widowed, all before she even gets close to middle age. Her story, like many, is marked by a kind of emotional exhaustion. Love isn't just hard in Viking society, it's a full contact sport with no helmets. Now picture yourself as a young Viking man in this world. You want to marry, you need land, status and livestock to even be considered. You might duel another suitor, you might impress the bride's father with tales of battle or show up with a sack of silver and a really aggressive poem. You might fail, and if you don't fail, if you land the match, then the real performance begins, earning respect from your new in-laws, proving your worth, and hoping your new wife doesn't loathe you. This wasn't a society where a marriage began with love and built towards stability. It started with utility and hoped to grow something like affection from there. And it wasn't always a disaster. Some Viking couples genuinely seem to connect. There are verses written by husbands grieving their wives, and tales of partnerships that read more like friendships than transactions. Still, those were exceptions. The norm was something colder. Here's the fringe detail no one talks about. Vikings had literal marriage markets at major gatherings like the Thing, the legal assembly that functioned as both court and festival. While people were airing lawsuits and buying salted fish, they were also brokering marriages. You could walk into one of these gatherings and leave with a new wife and a goat if you were lucky. Or just the goat, if you weren't. And what about the women? Their future could be sealed with a handshake between men, but they weren't entirely powerless. In some regions, women could divorce their husbands with little more than a public statement. If he mistreated her, failed to support her, or was too cowardly in battle, she could pack up her dowry and walk. But before the vows, she had to rely on her family's negotiation skills, or, if she was bold, her own sabotage tactics. Some sagas tell of women cursing suitors, faking madness, or enlisting help from seers and witches to avoid unwanted marriages. Magic and manipulation were survival tools. If a woman couldn't fight with steel, she fought with symbols, and often that was enough. Scholars still argue over how symbolic these stories are. Were they rare exceptions dressed up as legend? Or did more Viking women rebel quietly, out of sight of the scribes? That's the open question, one we'll probably never answer completely. But what we can see is this: love, desire, and romance were always there, burning under the frostbite of politics and practicality. And when a couple finally reached the wedding night, that was just the start of another complicated chapter. And in Viking society, marriage didn't just bind two people. It bound property, alliances, and expectations. It meant building a life on a farm that barely survived the winter, raising children, and trying not to die from infection, starvation, or raiders. Sexy, right? Still, there were rules. Ancient ones, built into every horn toast and hand fasting. And next, we'll step into the heart of that contract. What marriage really meant in the Viking world, and why your livestock might be more important than your feelings. You wake up on a hard straw mattress in a drafty longhouse, the air thick with the smell of dried fish and damp wool. There's a newlywed couple in the corner, both looking slightly dazed. Not from love, but from the sudden realization that marriage in Viking society is less about hearts and more about herds. Because congratulations, you're not just wed, you're economically entangled. In this world, marriage isn't a romantic destination, it's a farm management strategy. You glance around, the wedding feast has ended, salted lamb bones gnawed down to nubs, horn mugs scattered on the table. The bride's family is gone, their job done. She's here now, standing beside her new husband, probably already calculating how much linen they can trade before winter. This isn't a honeymoon, it's a contract execution. And no, not the fun kind of execution. In Viking culture, marriage was the glue that held farms, clans, and property lines together. Think less soulmate and more strategic merger. Romantic affection could come later, if it came at all. What really mattered was cattle, inheritance, and children, not in that order. The backbone of Viking society was the farmstead, and for a farmstead to work you needed labour, land, and loyalty. Marriage provided all three. The woman would bring a dowry, sometimes coins, often household goods, livestock, or land access. The man in turn had to offer something called a mundr, the groom's payment to the bride's family, a kind of reverse dowry that said, yes, I can feed and protect her, and yes, I'm good for at least 2 cows and some silver. This wasn't a gift, it was a financial promise, and breaking it could mean lawsuits or blood feuds. And here's the real kicker. If a couple divorced, she could take her dowry back. And if the mundr hadn't been paid in full, the husband might be on the hook for more, so you can think of marriage less like a fairy tale and more like a Viking version of prenups and joint investments, with a dash of sword play. But don't mistake the contract for cruelty. This system gave some women surprising power. Because property mattered more than poetry, Viking women could gain leverage. A well-dowered woman was a bargaining chip. She could inherit land, she could own property. In some cases, she could become the head of a household, especially if widowed. So, while love was often missing from the start, mutual respect and cooperation had room to grow. Still, let's be clear. Not all marriages were equal. Wealthy families could marry for political gain, aligning themselves with powerful clans. Poorer families might marry to survive. And for some, marriage was simply about not dying alone during a winter that could kill you if you ran out of dried fish or firewood. Your partner wasn't just your lover. They were your co-manager, co-parent, co-survivor. Sexy, right? Imagine 2 newlyweds waking up after their wedding night. Maybe it went well, maybe it didn't. Either way, today they start their first full day as co-runners of a household. That might mean repairing a leaking roof, feeding pigs, or chopping firewood until their fingers bleed. There's not a lot of time for love notes, but there's a certain intimacy and survival. an unspoken bond formed when you haul water from the same frozen stream every morning. Historically, this is where things get interesting. Most of what we know about Viking marriage comes from sagas, law codes, and the odd bit of archaeology. And those sources suggest that marriage was expected to be sexually active, at least enough to produce children. If you couldn't have kids, that was a problem. If you wouldn't have kids, that was a scandal. There are sagas where a man accuses his wife of withholding sex and takes her to court. Yes, really. In a society that needed sons to fight and daughters to marry off, infertility wasn't just sad, it was destabilising. But let's not pretend this was always a two-way street. A woman could try to leave a husband who didn't satisfy her, but she'd need proof: abuse, cowardice, or failure to provide. A man, on the other hand, could end a marriage if his wife shamed him publicly, or if she was caught cheating, or if she just didn't bring in enough value. Value in this case could mean anything from weaving cloth to bearing healthy children. Basically, marriage was love with a ledger. Here's your quirky fringe fact. Some weddings included symbolic rituals involving swords, hammers, or animal blood. In one reconstruction of an Old Norse ceremony, the groom places a sword on the bride's lap as a sign of transferring protection, and maybe also fertility. In other versions, Thor's hammer is placed in the bride's hands, invoking strength and the blessing of the gods. Romantic? Debatable? Metal? Absolutely. But here's where historians love to argue. How consistent were these traditions across the Viking world? The Norse weren't one uniform culture. Iceland, Norway, Denmark, Sweden all had their variations. A ritual in one village might be totally unknown in another. Some scholars believe Viking weddings were heavily localised, with families inventing their own ceremonies to fit clan identity and community expectations. Others think there was a shared Norse template loosely followed. The truth? Probably somewhere in between. And then there's the drama of post-wedding life. You're now a married Viking. Congratulations. Now spend the next 40 years not dying, while raising children who'll eventually avenge your death or take over the goat farm. If your partner dies early, very possible, you're expected to remarry quickly. Widows were highly sought after, especially those with land and working hips. Love, again, was optional. Still, there's something haunting about this system. So many marriages started as calculations but ended with partnership, shared jokes by the fire, quiet grief when one died, stories passed on to children and grandchildren. The sagas don't always focus on this, but sometimes, if you read between the blood and betrayals, you find it. Small moments of tenderness in a harsh world. And maybe, just maybe, some of those couples found something that looked like love. Maybe not the fairy tale, but a different kind of love, weathered, worn in, and quietly resilient. Next, we'll take a closer look at the mundr, that fascinating Viking marriage payment, and why giving your future in-laws a horse might be the most romantic thing you ever do. You're standing in the middle of a windswept field now, a long afternoon sun slanting over the rolling hills. There's a group of men nearby, serious-faced and fur-cloaked, inspecting a tethered horse, 2 silver armbands, and what appears to be an extremely unimpressed goat. This isn't just a livestock auction, it's a proposal, or more accurately, it's the mundr, the groom's gift, a central part of Viking marriage that makes you realise just how transactional things really were. In today's world, a flashy ring might symbolise commitment. In Viking society, it was cows, or silver, or land, or all of the above. The mundr wasn't optional. It was a required part of the marriage contract, and it wasn't given to the bride. It was given to her family, as in, "Thank you for allowing me to marry your daughter. Here's 3 cows, a cloak pin, and some iron tools. May we all prosper." Love language? No, but it was legally binding. You might think of this as a reverse dowry, and in some ways it is. The bride's family offers a dowry to the couple, household goods, land rights, livestock, while the groom offers the mundr to the bride's kin. It's a two-way street paved with expectations. If either side didn't come through, the marriage could be dissolved. The mundr said, "I can provide. I'm serious. I won't just wander off into the woods after 2 seasons and leave her with 3 kids and no firewood." It was proof of stability, maturity, and social standing. But here's the catch. The size of your mundr mattered. A lot. Too small, and the bride's family might see it as an insult. Too large, and people would assume you were compensating for other deficiencies. Socially it was a delicate balance, and since Viking men were deeply invested in their honour, being shamed for offering a weak mundr could start a feud, or a fist fight, or both. There's a reason half the sagas begin with something like, so-and-so insulted so-and-so at a feast, and then a whole bunch of people died. This wasn't a romantic culture, but it was one deeply sensitive to social standing. Your wealth, your generosity, and even your public gestures all reflected on your family's honour. The mundr was one of those gestures. Paying it showed you were serious about joining another clan. Failing to pay it, or paying too little, could ruin your reputation. And once you'd paid it, you were expected to follow through. Ghosting your new bride was not an option. Here's a quirky fact. Sometimes the mundr included ceremonial items, like a sword that had been in the groom's family for generations. These heirlooms had symbolic weight. By offering them, the groom was saying, "I am merging my bloodline with yours. My ancestors approve. Also, please don't stab me with this later." The more ancient and decorated the item, the more impressive the gesture. The laws around this stuff were surprisingly specific. Icelandic legal texts like Gragas go into detail about how and when the mundr should be paid, who witnessed it, and what recourse there was if things fell apart. In some cases, if a groom died before the wedding night, the mundr still had to be partially honoured. That's how binding it was. This wasn't a gift you gave lightly. It was a pledge of alliance, sealed in goods. And here's where the scholars like to debate. Some argue the mundr was mostly symbolic, something done for show, with a bit of livestock swapped to make it official. Others think it was a hard financial requirement that separated the worthy from the unworthy. Archaeological finds support both theories. Some grave sites contain elaborate wedding goods, signs of rich, alliance-heavy marriages. Others show more humble beginnings, maybe more rooted in local affection than political calculation. So let's say you're a groom now, standing in that chilly field, goats bleating awkwardly beside you. You hand over your offerings, make your vows, and share a drink with your bride's father. The deal is done. You've paid your mundr, she's yours now, or rather, you belong to each other under the watchful eyes of every single person you know. No pressure. But the mundr isn't just about money, it's about assurance. The bride's family wants to know you won't vanish, that you'll provide, that their daughter will be respected, housed and protected. In that way, the mundr is oddly touching, a kind of pre-modern prenup that says, yes, this is serious. I will stake part of my fortune on it. Yet even this system had loopholes. If a couple ran off together without the family's blessing, what we might call eloping, they could still be married technically, but the absence of a mundr would throw everything into legal chaos. Was the marriage valid? Could she keep her dowry? Did he owe a retroactive mundr? Sagas sometimes include scenes where a marriage is challenged years later because someone failed to pay what was promised. That one goat, that unpaid armband, it could come back to haunt you, and the price of betrayal. Let's just say the Viking legal system wasn't big on forgiveness. If a man accepted a mundr, married off his daughter, and then the groom insulted or abandoned her, it wasn't just personal, it was economic. It could escalate quickly into revenge, lawsuits, or a quiet midnight stabbing in the forest. As always with Viking society, the personal and the political were braided so tightly you could barely tell them apart. Still, not every story ends in blood. Sometimes the mundr was paid, the bride and groom made a go of it, and years later they were still together, older, wearier, and probably grumbling about how everything was better before the Danes came to town. That's the Viking version of growing old together. So you've paid your mundr, you've made it through the wedding feast without offending anyone, and you've survived your first few awkward weeks as a husband. What's next? Well, if you're lucky, and if the winter gods are kind, you might just get to flirt a little, learn the art of Viking courtship, and maybe even spark something like real love. But don't get too cozy. Viking flirting is more dangerous than it sounds. The snow is falling outside now, big lazy flakes drifting down over the roof of the longhouse, softening the edges of the world into a kind of icy silence. Inside, the fire crackles low, casting golden light across fur cloaks and iron tools, but your attention's elsewhere. You're watching a young man across the room lean in toward a woman near the hearth. He says something you can't hear, and she laughs. Low, guarded, but not dismissive. And just like that, you're witnessing one of the rarest dances in Viking society. Courtship. To be clear, flirting in the Viking Age wasn't exactly flowers and candlelight. This is a society where emotions are buried under layers of frostbite, family obligation, and the constant threat of being chopped in half. But that doesn't mean they didn't have a sense of romance, just a very sharp-edged one. So how did courtship happen when you were wrapped in 6 layers of wool and constantly surrounded by relatives, livestock, and judgmental neighbours? Well, you got creative. In the dark, cold months, when you were stuck indoors with the same dozen people and going slowly insane, there were games, storytelling, feasting, and yes, opportunities for romantic manoeuvring. A sideways glance here, a shared bowl of stew there. The wintertime offered a kind of forced intimacy. You saw people at their worst, dirty, cranky, and barely washing. And if you still found yourself sneaking glances at someone across the fire pit, maybe that was love. And then there were the verses. Vikings loved poetry, especially the skaldic kind. Dense, complicated, metaphor-stuffed lines that would make modern lyricists cry. A young man might compose a love poem full of kennings. Those classic Norse metaphors like calling a woman a gold-ringed tree or describing her eyes as swan road mirrors. If that sounds like gibberish, well, it kind of was. But to a Viking woman, it might have been swoon-worthy, or it might have gotten you slapped, depending on how good your metaphors were. One historical account tells of a man composing a verse for a woman that basically compared her to battle spoils. She was not amused, he ended up exiled. Lesson: even Vikings had standards. And then there's the sword dance. No, not metaphorically. Actual sword dancing. Men would perform daring feats of agility and skill, flipping blades, leaping between them, all while trying not to impale themselves. It was a mix of performance, flirtation, and raw testosterone. If you pulled it off, you might earn admiration. If you tripped and sliced your leg open, well, better luck next Yule. But the boldest form of Viking flirting was the nighttime visit. Called utisetta in some accounts, though the term has multiple meanings, this practice involved a young man sneaking into or near a woman's sleeping area, often during festivals or gatherings. Sometimes it was prearranged, sometimes it was not. If the woman allowed it, the visit could become intimate. If she didn't, and the man persisted, he risked legal action, social ruin, or an axe to the face. Consent was murky, context-dependent, and always risky. This was not a society with easy boundaries. Which brings us to the uncomfortable truth. In Viking courtship, lines were often blurred. Publicly, a man had to be honourable, respectful, and careful not to insult a woman's reputation. Privately, things were less clear. Some sagas hint at seductions that were framed as consensual but probably weren't. Others show women initiating relationships boldly, sometimes even disguising themselves as men to win over a lover. The rules weren't fixed. They bent, flexed, and often snapped entirely depending on status, setting, and who was telling the story later. And of course, not everyone got to flirt freely. Social rank played a massive role. A wealthy chieftain's daughter could reject suitors and choose her match. A poor farm girl might not get a choice at all. A high-status man could get away with a lot more than his lower-ranking counterpart. This wasn't a merit-based dating game. It was strategic, uneven, and laced with danger. Still, among all this risk and calculation, there were stories of real affection. One saga tells of a couple who met during a feast and secretly exchanged gifts over several months. A carved bone comb, a piece of embroidered cloth, a ring. These tokens weren't just sentimental, they were risky. Being caught with a gift from the wrong person could spark rumours, or worse, a feud. But they did it anyway. That low burn, against the odds kind of love, very Viking. And here's your quirky detail for tonight. In some cases, love graffiti was left behind on runestones, wooden walls, or tools. A carving in runes might read something like, "I carved this for the woman I love," or "Baldur was here, miss me Sigrid." Viking love notes, hidden in the corners of daily life. Nothing extravagant, just a small act of defiance against the cold, hard world. But scholars still argue over how much weight to give these stories. Were they common, or just romantic outliers preserved because they were interesting? Some believe most Viking marriages were cold, calculated, and devoid of romance. Others point to the frequency of love verses and saga subplots to argue that emotion, desire, jealousy, even heartbreak, was a vital part of the culture. The truth probably lives in that messy middle ground. Vikings weren't robots. They just had very little room for soft feelings in a world that expected them to die young and violently. Still, courtship wasn't always about long-term love. Sometimes it was about desire. Vikings had words for casual lovers, mistresses, even flings that didn't lead to marriage. There were rules, of course, rules that we'll get into later, but the idea that people wanted each other outside of wedlock, totally on the table, and often under it. So tonight, as the fire dims and someone starts playing a slow rhythm on a bone flute, you watch that young couple near the hearth again. Her hand brushes his face is flushed from mead. No one else notices, or pretends not to. In this hard, brittle world, even a moment like this feels like rebellion. And yet, everything they're doing now, whispered words, shy touches, unspoken hope, it could lead to a battle, a scandal, a wedding, or all three. Because in Viking society, the price of affection was always higher than it looked. Next, we'll pull back the curtain, literally, and explore where all this courtship leads, into the smoky, not-so-private bedrooms, where power, class, and permission collided. The longhouse is quiet again, quiet in the way that only happens late at night, after the mead has run out, the songs have softened, and even the dogs have curled up in corners. But the air is still charged. There's movement behind the hanging curtains that divide the benches from the central hearth. Soft rustling, a breath, a low voice. And though the walls are thin, if they exist at all, no one says anything, because everyone knows what's happening and no one wants to be the first to make it awkward. This is how intimacy works in Viking society. There's no locked door, no private suite, just fur-covered platforms tucked behind woven hangings where couples do their best to pretend they're alone. You're not, of course. Your aunt is asleep 10 feet away. There's a chicken in the rafters. Someone just coughed. But you carry on. Privacy, as we think of it, didn't exist. Physical space was a communal resource. Bedrooms weren't rooms. They were sections of benches or straw-filled beds that ran along the longhouse's perimeter. Wealthier families might build a slightly more closed-off alcove, but even that offered thin barriers at best. You could hear everything, smell everything, and depending on where you were sleeping, see more than you wanted. So how did couples manage? Carefully. They learned to whisper, to move quietly, to wait until the fire was low and most of the house was pretending to be asleep. In some ways, this made intimacy more intense. Stolen moments in plain sight, quiet rebellion in a culture of constant scrutiny. But not everyone had the same experience. The dynamics of the Viking bedroom were shaped heavily by class and status. A chieftain's son could court and bed whom he pleased, within reason. A farmhand, not so much. And for enslaved people, the thralls, sex wasn't just about desire or relationships, it was often about survival. Consent in these cases gets complicated fast. Free women had rights. They could reject a suitor, demand divorce, or shame a man who disrespected them. But thrall women had no such power. They could be forced to sleep with their masters or passed between households as part of a transaction. These relationships were rarely romantic and frequently exploitative, even if some later sagas tried to paint them in more palatable terms. The truth is, enslaved people in Viking society occupied the bottom of the social ladder, and their bodies were often treated as property. The uncomfortable part? These relationships were normalized. A free man fathering a child with a thrall wasn't necessarily scandalous, unless he tried to elevate her or give the child inheritance rights. That's when things got legally thorny. But the act itself? Fairly common. So the Viking bedroom wasn't just a place for passion. It was a stage where power played out, silently, uncomfortably, and often unchallenged. Yet among the free and relatively equal, sex wasn't always grim. It could be affectionate, playful, even joyful. Some sagas describe married couples who genuinely seem to like each other. There's one story of a husband who makes his wife laugh every morning by pretending to trip over the same stool. Another of a wife who hides her husband's axe when he's being too dramatic. These aren't epic gestures, they're domestic ones. And in a world full of brutal winters and shorter lifespans, that kind of intimacy might have meant more than poetry ever could. And here's a fact that surprises people. Vikings were fairly open about the act itself. While modesty was expected in public, sex wasn't treated as shameful. There were laws about who you could sleep with, and when, and under what conditions. But the act itself wasn't taboo. In fact, some rituals, especially fertility rites, involved symbolic or literal acts of sex as part of honouring the gods. We'll get there later. But for now, just know that Vikings weren't prudes. They were practical. If it contributed to family, legacy, or spiritual health, it was fair game. Still, there were expectations. A husband was expected to satisfy his wife, just as she was expected to bear children. If he couldn't perform, or wouldn't, she had legal grounds for divorce, and she could be brutal about it. One saga tells of a woman who publicly declared that her husband was no man in bed and demanded her dowry back. He tried to sue her for defamation. The court ruled in her favour. In Viking society, your sexual reputation mattered, and it could be used against you. The same went for women. A wife accused of withholding intimacy without cause could face public shame, or even be returned to her family. Of course, cause was a flexible term. If she had bruises or signs of neglect, she might win sympathy. If not, she had an uphill battle. So while women had more rights here than in many medieval societies, they still walked a narrow line, especially behind the curtain. And here's your oddball detail for the night. Some longhouses had carved wooden bedposts with fertility symbols, snakes, knotwork, even suggestive fruit shapes. These weren't decorative. They were charms, meant to ensure healthy offspring and maybe, just maybe, a better night under the furs. Scholars debate how widespread this was, but enough examples exist to suggest it wasn't uncommon. Vikings loved symbolism. If they could carve it, they could bless it. What's still debated, though, is how often intimacy was truly mutual. Were Viking couples emotionally connected, or just going through the motions of duty and expectation? Some researchers argue that love wasn't part of the marriage equation at all, just biology and alliance. Others point to the sagas, the poetry, the jokes and grief and jealousy, and say, no, love was there, just not the way we expect it. So as the longhouse darkens completely and the fire dies down to red coals, you listen to the silence behind the curtains, a quiet breath, a rustle of furs, maybe a whisper, maybe a giggle. Life goes on, and in that moment, love, or at least connection, flickers quietly in the shadows. But don't get too comfortable, because not every relationship stayed cozy. Some turned dark, others crossed lines that even Viking law couldn't ignore. And when consent collided with power, things got much more dangerous. You wake to the sound of boots on packed earth. It's still dark outside, that deep black silence just before dawn, but someone's moving with purpose. There's tension in the air, thicker than the smoke from last night's fire. Something's wrong. You shift under your furs, and from a quiet conversation near the door, you catch just a few words: thrall, child, shame. And that's when it clicks. Another household scandal, another blurred line between duty, desire, and power. In Viking society, the most vulnerable people weren't just the poor. They were the enslaved. Thralls, men and women who laboured without rights, sold like cattle, traded like goods, and often treated as such. A free man's power extended into every part of his household, and that included sexual access to his slaves. That's where we go tonight, into the murky, deeply uncomfortable world of love, sex, and consent, when power was completely imbalanced. The Viking economy leaned heavily on enslaved labour. Thralls worked the fields, tended the animals, mended clothes, hauled water, and sometimes raised the free family's children. They were part of the daily rhythm of life, and always beneath it. A thrall could be born into slavery or captured during raids. Their lives permanently altered the moment they were dragged aboard a longship. And once they arrived in a Norse settlement, their autonomy, especially over their own bodies, was effectively erased. Female thralls were particularly vulnerable. They were often assigned to domestic roles, which meant close proximity to the master of the house, and proximity in this context often led to abuse. Some masters used their thralls as concubines, informally kept partners who served both labour and sexual functions. Sometimes these relationships were ongoing, even acknowledged publicly. Other times they were hidden, denied, or violently imposed. The most disturbing part: there were few legal protections for thralls. In the eyes of the law, they weren't people in the same sense as free men and women. Their suffering didn't hold the same weight. If a master impregnated a thrall, the child's status usually followed the mother's, enslaved. Unless, of course, the father decided to legitimize the child. Then, things got complicated. Imagine a wealthy landowner who fathers several children by different thralls. If he elevates one, gives them education or property, the entire inheritance structure shifts. His legal heirs might object. Marriages could unravel. Entire clans could feud. That's not hypothetical. It happened. There are sagas littered with hints of bastard children, secret lovers, and dramatic revelations that would make modern soap operas look tame. And yet, not all relationships between free men and thralls were abusive, at least not in the eyes of the sources. Some sagas frame these unions as consensual, even affectionate. One tells of a man who falls in love with a foreign thrall he captured during a raid. He frees her, marries her, and their descendants become central characters in the story. Sounds sweet, until you remember how she ended up in his household in the first place. Love might have grown later, but it started in a cage. There's a fierce scholarly debate here. Some argue these stories are romanticized excuses for what was essentially coercion. Others believe a few rare cases of upward mobility existed, and that some enslaved women used charm, intellect, or even manipulation to change their fates. The truth? Probably both. Power was never evenly distributed, but agency still flickered in the cracks. People survive how they can, even when survival means bending toward the desires of someone who owns your future. For male thralls, the situation wasn't much better. A male slave caught sleeping with a free woman could be punished severely, flogged, mutilated, even executed. The imbalance was stark. A free man could use a thrall as he pleased. A thrall touching a free woman was a crime. The law was very clear on who mattered and who didn't. And here's your quirky, unsettling fact. Some laws allowed masters to sell the unborn children of their thralls, essentially placing a price on life before it even began. These weren't just brutal economics. They were decisions that shaped bloodlines, property, and power. A pregnant thrall was a liability, a bargaining chip, or a political problem, depending on who the father was and how much noise the rest of the household made. Some longhouses developed whispered rules about these things. Maybe everyone knew that the master's housemaid was more than just a maid. Maybe the mistress of the house turned a blind eye, or quietly poisoned her rival's stew. Power struggles weren't just between armies. They happened by the hearth, in the soft hours of night, behind drawn curtains. And what of the children born of these imbalanced unions? If the father acknowledged them, they might be freed, educated, or used to forge new alliances. If not, they remained thralls, servants to the very household that bore them. There's tragedy there, unspoken but heavy, in how many lives must have begun in silence and shame. Modern scholars continue to argue over just how normalized these dynamics were. Some claim sexual relationships with thralls were relatively rare and frowned upon. Others see them as widespread and practically institutional. Archaeology can't answer this. Bones don't show social status. But the sagas, with their evasive storytelling and moral grey zones, suggest that everyone knew, and no one talked. Still, a few voices ring out. One poem, attributed to a skald speaking in a woman's voice, describes being taken without song or gift. Her body, a prize without glory. Whether fiction or truth, it's one of the few echoes of pain that managed to slip past the bravado of the sagas. A quiet cry, still audible centuries later. So tonight, as you roll over under your furs, think of the other beds in the longhouse. The ones in the shadows. The ones no one speaks about. The ones where choice didn't exist but consequence always did. And as we move forward, we'll leave the heavy quiet behind, for now, and step into the wild, myth-soaked world of gods and giants, where love and sex get even stranger, and sometimes divine. Brace yourself. The Norse gods weren't exactly subtle. You step outside the longhouse and into a world that feels both familiar and impossible. The landscape's still there, jagged cliffs, icy winds, the distant howl of wolves, but the sky looks too wide, too sharp. Something's off, and that's when you realise you've stepped into myth. Not just stories told by firelight, but the living, breathing chaos of the Norse cosmos, where gods seduce, deceive, and occasionally turn into animals to get what or who they want. Tonight, we tumble headfirst into the part of Viking culture where love and sex weren't just human experiences, they were cosmic forces, wielded like weapons by beings who could reshape the world. Let's start with the obvious. The Norse gods were a messy bunch. Forget the noble, aloof Olympians of Greece. The Aesir and the Vanir, the two main families of Norse gods, were more like an immortal version of your least stable neighbours. Powerful, yes, but also jealous, horny, violent, and prone to magical acts of pettiness. Love in this pantheon? It was rarely gentle. Sex, often political. Consent, frequently optional. Take Freya, the goddess of love, beauty, fertility, war, and magic. A walking contradiction. She's one of the most powerful figures in Norse mythology, a Vanir goddess who lives among the Aesir and commands the magical art of saga, a form of prophecy and manipulation. She's also the subject of relentless desire. Gods, giants, and mortals alike want her, chase her, scheme to possess her. In one myth, a builder offers to create a wall around Asgard in exchange for Freya's hand. The gods agree, thinking he'll fail, and when he almost doesn't, they panic. It's worth noting no one actually asks Freya how she feels about being traded like a brick payment. The myths are full of these moments, where female figures are pursued, offered, or transformed without much agency. And yet Freya, more than most, fights back. She owns her sexuality, uses it, and sometimes weaponizes it. She's accused by Loki of sleeping with every god, elf, and brother she has, which says more about Loki's attitude than Freya's behaviour. She walks the fine line between sacred and scandalous, and the Vikings seem to love her for it. Then there's Loki himself. Trickster, shapeshifter, agent of chaos, an absolute wildcard in the Viking love and sex department. Loki doesn't just bend gender roles, he cartwheels over them while throwing glitter. In one of his most infamous myths, he shapeshifts into a mare, a female horse, seduces a stallion, and later gives birth to an 8-legged foal named Sleipnir. You can't make this up. Or rather, someone did make this up, and Vikings told it around fires for centuries. The story is usually treated with nervous laughter, like, haha, remember when Loki became a horse and got pregnant? Classic. But the undercurrent is serious. Loki's fluid identity, sometimes male, sometimes female, sometimes beyond both, was unsettling even to the gods. His transgressions weren't just sexual, they were cosmological. He crossed boundaries that were supposed to be fixed, and in Viking society, crossing boundaries always came with consequences. Modern scholars argue over how to interpret these myths. Some see them as comedic farce, divine soap operas meant to entertain and confuse. Others view them as reflections of ancient beliefs about gender, sexuality, and power. Was Loki's shapeshifting a symbol of transgression, a celebration of fluidity, a warning? Maybe all three. But Loki wasn't the only one getting weird with love. Odin, the All-Father, was also deeply entangled in the mystical side of desire. He practiced Sida, which was considered a feminine magic, and that alone got him roasted by other gods. Practicing Sida meant Odin had to channel a more submissive, receptive role in ritual, and for Viking men obsessed with honour and dominance, this was taboo. That's right. Odin, the god of war and wisdom, was mocked for being unmanly, because he dared to dabble in magic associated with women. Masculinity in Norse culture was a tightrope, even for gods. And what about mortal love in the sagas shaped by these divine stories? The boundaries blurred constantly. If a god wanted a mortal woman, he took her. If a giantess wanted a man, she transformed him. If someone wanted to bind their lover, they used magic, charms, or sacred runes to do so. Magic and sex were deeply intertwined. In some myths, a well-placed spell could inflame desire, or destroy it. People believed that lust could be summoned, manipulated, or cursed. Here's your quirky fringe detail. There were magical symbols carved into talismans and bones, Galdrastafir, used for love, seduction, or fertility. Some of these runes were placed beneath beds, sewn into clothes, or whispered during rituals. One particularly spicy rune combination allegedly helped you obtain the woman you desire. No mention of whether she got a say in the matter. Creepy? Kind of. Powerful? Definitely. The Vikings believed love wasn't just emotion, it was a force to be harnessed. But again, not everyone agrees on how literally these myths were taken. Some scholars think the wildest stories, Loki's horse escapade, Odin's magical vulnerability, were metaphorical, intended to teach lessons about balance, chaos, or the danger of unchecked desire. Others think they reflect real practices and beliefs, filtered through poetic exaggeration. Were there Vikings who saw sex as sacred, tangled up with fate and the gods? Almost certainly. Were there others who just liked a good story about divine drama? Also, yes. The result is a mythology that doesn't draw clean lines between love, sex, magic, and identity. It smears them all together in a chaotic, shimmering blur. And that chaos bled into real life. People made offerings to Freya for fertility. They feared Loki's tricks. They carved runes into bones, hoping to attract a lover or repel a rival. Myth and reality weren't separate worlds. They overlapped, reinforced each other, shaped how people behaved in their own tangled relationships. So as you leave this divine fever dream and step back into the smoky haze of your longhouse, remember, the gods you worshipped weren't models of purity or order. They were reflections of your own desires, fears, and contradictions. And in a world where love could come from a charm, a dream, or a god in disguise, nothing was ever simple. Next, we'll bring things back down to earth, sort of, and peek into the hidden lives of Viking warriors and their affairs. Because when men sailed off for years at a time, not every relationship stayed loyal or public. The sea air is sharp in your lungs, and the deck beneath your feet creaks with every rise and fall of the waves. You're on a Viking longship now, headed out with a crew of warriors, merchants, and probably a stowaway goat. Everyone's tense but excited. There are lands to raid, trade to make, and songs to sing about both. But as the coastline fades behind you, so does something else. Accountability. Back home, you might have a wife, a family, even an arrangement with the gods. Out here things get flexible. Tonight we're cracking open the chest of secrets known as Viking infidelity. Welcome to the private affairs of warriors, messy, complicated, and sometimes oddly pragmatic. Because when you sail for months, or years, at a time, the line between loyalty and opportunity gets blurry fast. Let's start with the basics. Viking marriages, as we've already seen, were structured like contracts. There were expectations: share a bed, raise children, manage a household. But there was also a lot of room. Not emotional room, literal room. Physical absence. Viking men, especially the high-status ones, were often gone for long stretches, off to raid, explore, trade, or get themselves killed in Ireland. This left their wives in charge of the household, the farm, the finances, and everything else. It also opened the door for both partners to, shall we say, reinterpret the terms of their agreement. Male infidelity wasn't exactly condoned, but it also wasn't shocking. A married man sleeping with a thrall, a concubine, or even a willing partner abroad wasn't likely to get dragged into court. As long as he didn't bring shame on his household, or produce an illegitimate child who caused inheritance issues, most people looked the other way. It was one of those unspoken Viking social rules. Don't be messy about it, and don't expect applause. That said, if he was messy, say boasting about conquests, bringing home a new lover, or ignoring his wife entirely, he could expect consequences. Viking women, particularly the free and well-connected ones, were not shy about calling out their husband's behaviour. One saga tells of a woman who cursed her husband in front of their entire village after he returned from a voyage with a concubine in tow. The concubine didn't last long, neither did the husband's dignity. Now, about those concubines. The concept in Viking society was real, though the details are hazy. Some concubines were long-term companions, taken from conquered lands or purchased as thralls. Others were more like informal partners. No wedding, but shared meals, shared beds, and sometimes shared children. It was a grey area, legally and socially. A man might refer to his concubine as a woman of the house, but unless she was freed and married, she remained outside the system of inheritance and legitimacy. Still, some concubines gained power, especially if their partners valued them, or if they bore sons. A few became de facto wives, running households and managing property when the legal wife was absent or dead. But they always lived in the shadow of legitimacy. One wrong move and they could be sold, displaced, or ignored entirely. The line between lover and liability was always one misstep away. And what about the wives left behind? Here's where things get juicy. Viking women had autonomy, more than most medieval women certainly, and that included the ability to divorce a husband who abandoned or mistreated them. If he was gone too long without word, she could declare him legally dead. If she discovered he'd taken another woman, she could make it very public. And in some cases, she didn't wait around. Affairs weren't unheard of, though riskier for women. A wife caught cheating could be shamed, beaten, or divorced on the spot. But that didn't stop it from happening. Some sagas hint at quiet liaisons, secret pregnancies, and whispered arrangements between lonely wives and ambitious farmhands. One tale even includes a love triangle that ends in a duel between two would-be suitors while the wife watches from a hillside, amused. The winner doesn't win her. She just goes home and finishes her weaving. Here's your quirky fact for the night. Viking law allowed for prearranged side relationships in some cases, particularly in Iceland. These were sometimes acknowledged openly, especially if children were involved. One man might live with his legal wife in one valley and visit his second woman in another. It wasn't common, but it wasn't illegal either. As long as inheritance and property rights were respected, the heart had some room to wander. But of course, there were rules. If a man fathered a child with a woman outside his marriage, he had to acknowledge the child or risk legal consequences. If he refused to support the child, the woman's family could sue him. And if the affair became public and scandalous, that could trigger feuds, actual bloody multi-generational feuds. In Viking culture, reputation wasn't just personal, it was political. Embarrass your clan and you might find yourself exiled, shamed, or worse. And let's not forget the travelling lovers. Viking men often formed relationships abroad, especially in areas they settled, like the British Isles or parts of Russia. Sometimes they married local women, creating complicated cross-cultural families. Other times they left behind children who never saw them again. Archaeological evidence shows Norse graves with Celtic and Slavic women buried beside them, suggesting long-term unions that never made it into the sagas. Love, in the Viking Age, was mobile, messy, often one-sided. Modern scholars still argue over how common these double lives were. Some believe most Viking men stayed loyal, especially those who were deeply tied to their communities. Others see the evidence, legal texts, sagas, stray runestones, as proof that infidelity was baked into the social structure. The truth probably varies, like most things human. So as you sit now by the edge of the ship listening to the waves slap against the hull, you wonder what waits back home. A wife keeping the hearth lit? A lover hoping for your return? Or maybe a replacement who's already taken your seat at the table? In Viking society, absence didn't always make the heart grow fonder. Sometimes it just made room. And when you do return, bearded, bruised, and full of stories, you'll have to face whatever's waiting. Maybe forgiveness, maybe fury, maybe both. But before we get there, let's talk about something even more ancient than infidelity. The magic that helped people seduce, bind, or punish the ones they loved. Because Viking romance had more curses than kisses, the smell hits you first. Sharp, herbal, strange, something burning, something bitter. You follow it to a shadowy clearing just beyond the edge of the settlement. The trees close in overhead, and in the centre of the grove stands a woman in a cloak made of feathers and bones, her hands moving rhythmically over a bowl filled with smoke and ash. She doesn't look at you, but she knows you're watching. She's casting something. Not just a spell, but a declaration, a weapon, a message. This is Viking witchcraft, and tonight it's all about love, lust, and revenge. In Norse culture, magic wasn't just for battles or crop blessings. It was deeply tied to emotion, especially the unruly kind. Love, heartbreak, jealousy, desire. These weren't private matters. They were cosmic forces, and when your heart couldn't get what it wanted the ordinary way, you turned to magic, or more accurately to someone who knew how to wield it. That someone was usually a woman, a vulva, a seeress, part spiritual guide and part social hazard. She might live on the edge of the village, show up during festivals, or be quietly summoned in the dead of night. And if your lover had strayed, or your heart was aching, or your body burned for someone who didn't notice you, she'd know what to do. Let's be clear. Viking love magic wasn't subtle. This wasn't light a candle and journal your feelings energy. It was grind a toad's bones, chant a cursed verse, bury it under his threshold, and wait for him to either come running or start bleeding from his nose. And yes, that's only a slight exaggeration. One common form of love magic involved runes, specifically carved symbols meant to ignite passion, sow obsession, or bind a partner emotionally and physically. These runes could be etched into objects, worn as charms, or hidden in the walls of someone's home. There are sagas where a woman places a rune under her rival's bed to ruin her fertility. Another tale speaks of a carved love spell tucked into a man's cloak that causes him to go mad with desire for the wrong woman. And then there were the herbs. The Norse world was rich with plants used for love potions, aphrodisiacs, and, let's be real, straight-up poison. Angelica root, mugwort, henbane, juniper, each one with specific properties, some for arousal, others for manipulation. These weren't used lightly. A misstep could mean death, madness, or a very awkward family gathering. But the most intense love magic, saga. This form of Norse sorcery, often performed in ritual trance, involved invoking spirits, manipulating fate, and accessing hidden knowledge. It was gendered, typically the domain of women, and considered dangerous for men to practice because it required a kind of spiritual submission. Odin, remember, was mocked for practicing saga. But he did it anyway, because saga worked. If you were desperate enough, you might ask a völva to perform saga on your behalf. This wasn't like hiring a matchmaker. This was a ceremony. Animal bones, chants, cloaks, and firelight. You'd sit, silent, while she muttered your lover's name into the dark and asked the spirits to twist his heart toward you. It might take days, or minutes, but once the spell was cast, it had weight. Not guaranteed results, but consequences, always. The line between seduction and control blurred fast. Was it love if you had to summon spirits to make it happen? Was it justice if your ex-lover suddenly lost his strength or developed boils in suspicious places? These weren't questions the sagas answered, but they asked them in quiet, uneasy ways. One saga tells of a woman scorned by her betrothed. She goes to a völva, returns home, and her ex begins to waste away, unable to sleep, haunted by dreams, obsessed with her despite himself. Eventually he crawls back to her and begs forgiveness. She refuses. He dies. That's one way to get closure. Here's your delightfully unsettling fringe fact. In some parts of the Viking world, people believed that sex could be bound with magic so tightly that a man might be rendered unable to perform with anyone but the spellcaster. There's even a term, fjolkingi, used to describe cunning women who could enchant genitals. Not metaphorically, literally. If that sounds like a mix of eroticism and terror, you're starting to understand the tone here, and while love magic was often seen as a woman's tool, men weren't entirely innocent. Some practiced rune magic or used charms to win affection, or domination. But their involvement was riskier. A man seen using these arts might be called ergi, unmanly, shameful, perverse. Masculinity in Viking society was rigid, and anything that hinted at passivity or trickery could get you mocked, fined, or stabbed. So most men kept their magical efforts quiet if they dabbled at all. Of course, not all spells were dark. Some were meant to inspire mutual desire, heal a broken bond, or bless a marriage bed with fertility. In these cases, magic wasn't manipulation. It was more like spiritual matchmaking. A couple might share a charm or whisper runes to each other before their wedding night. A woman might place herbs under her pillow to ensure a healthy child. These softer forms of magic existed, but they didn't make it into the stories as often. Drama sells better than contentment. Scholars still argue over how literal these practices were. Some believe most love magic stories are symbolic, allegories for power struggles, gender dynamics, or emotional desperation. Others believe people truly practiced them, even if not everyone believed they worked. The point was never just success, it was intention. Magic made you feel like you had a say in a world that rarely listened. So as the woman in the grove finishes her spell, scattering ash into the wind, you wonder who she was calling. A lost lover? A new one? A rival? The smoke curls upward and disappears into the trees. Somewhere, someone's life is about to change. Maybe slowly, maybe all at once. And as we return to the settlement, the echoes of that spell follow us. Because now it's time to talk about the women themselves, free women, not witches, who knew exactly what they wanted and weren't afraid to act on it. Some wielded magic, others wielded law, and a few wielded axes. The morning fog clings low to the ground as you walk through the village, past woven fences and drying racks strung with fish, past the forge where a young man hammers steel like he's angry at it, past a woman standing tall outside her home with a ledger in one hand and a cleaver in the other. She's not smiling. She's not waiting for anyone. This is her land, her household, her decisions. And if you assumed Viking women spent their lives in the shadows, barefoot and silent, You'd be very, very wrong. Tonight we step into the world of Norse women, their rights, their rage, their independence, and what happened when their men got stupid. Spoiler: Viking women were not here for your fragile ego. They could divorce you, shame you in public, out-argue you in court, and still manage to run a household while heavily pregnant and halfway through building a new barn. Let's start with something basic but revolutionary. Viking women had legal rights. Not theoretical ones, not symbolic ones. Actual, usable, everyday rights. They could inherit property, own land, manage estates, and initiate divorce. A married woman's dowry stayed hers. If the marriage ended, she could take it back, no questions asked. This wasn't some fringe Icelandic custom. This was baked into Norse law. And it wasn't just law, it was lived reality. Women were the backbone of Viking homesteads, especially when men were off raiding, trading, or dying gloriously in places they couldn't pronounce. The wife wasn't just a placeholder, she was the head of the household in her husband's absence. That included overseeing crops, livestock, household finances, and the people who worked the land. If things fell apart while he was gone, it was on her, so she made sure they didn't. But even when the men were home, Viking women weren't just sidekicks. The sagas are filled with strong, sharp-tongued women who take zero nonsense and dish out justice like they invented it. Take Unn the deep-minded, a widow who sails to Iceland, claims land, establishes a settlement, and arranges marriages for her descendants like a medieval CEO. Or Gudrun Osvífursdóttir, who goes through 4 husbands in one saga, each one more doomed than the last. She's clever, charismatic, and never once apologises for wanting more than she's offered. These weren't fictional superheroes, they were modelled on real women who wielded real power, and that power extended into the realm of love, marriage, and sex. If a Viking woman didn't like her husband, she could walk, literally. All she had to do was declare in front of witnesses that she was ending the marriage, usually with a tidy list of grievances like, "He's a coward, he beat me," or "He refuses to provide for the household." Then she took her dowry and left. One saga even mentions a woman standing at the threshold of her home, declaring her divorce while holding all her belongings. That's it. Ceremony over. He's out. She's free. Of course, it wasn't always that clean. Divorce could lead to feuds, especially if property or pride was at stake. But the fact that women could do it at all, and regularly did, is almost shocking compared to their medieval contemporaries in Christian Europe, where women were essentially property wrapped in veils. And Viking women didn't just get even in court, sometimes they got creative. One story tells of a wife who, after learning her husband was cheating with a thrall, publicly shamed him at a feast by singing a verse about how bad he was in bed. She then left with her dowry, her dignity, and possibly his favourite cloak. Another saga shows a woman who poisons her rival, not out of spite, but because the woman mocked her embroidery. You have to admire that kind of escalation. Viking women didn't wait for justice. They made it themselves, preferably with flair. Here's your fringe fact for the night. Some Viking women wielded legal authority themselves. Female law speakers were rare, but documented, especially in Iceland. Women could also act as witnesses, file lawsuits, and attend the Thing, the public assembly where laws were debated and disputes settled. So yes, there were Viking women who showed up to court in wool dresses and wrecked people. But this power wasn't evenly distributed. Wealth and family ties mattered. A high-status woman could do more, say more, and survive more than a low-status one. And thrall women, of course, had no rights at all. Their suffering was invisible, their choices non-existent. The powerful women in the sagas don't represent all Viking women. They just show what was possible if you were smart, rich, and relentless. Still, even ordinary women had their ways. A farmer's wife might quietly control every coin that passed through the household. A daughter might delay a marriage by weaving the same garment over and over, a subtle protest hidden in cloth. Magic, gossip, manipulation. These were all tools Viking women used when the law or culture failed them, because Viking society might have been male-dominated, but it was female-run. And scholars? They love to debate this. Some argue we over-romanticize Viking women, cherry-picking exceptional stories to paint a picture of empowerment that wasn't widespread. Others believe the sagas reflect a deep-rooted respect for feminine authority, one that Christian writers later tried to erase or soften. The real answer likely lies somewhere in the middle. Viking women had power, but it came with risk. They could speak up, but they had to be ready for blowback. Still, if you were a Viking man, it paid to keep your partner happy. Because if she turned on you, the consequences weren't just emotional. They were social, public, legal. Your manhood could be questioned, your status could plummet, and if you really messed up, well, you might find your bed empty, your goats gone, and your best tunic mysteriously full of holes. So tonight, as you sit beside the fire, glance over at the woman pouring mead with sharp eyes and a sharper tongue. She knows your secrets, she's heard the rumours, and she's already decided what to do about it. Next, we'll step across the line, into the darker corners of Norse lore, where not all love was legal, and not every kiss came with consent. Welcome to the world of taboo love and public punishment. You're at the edge of the village now, where the wind whistles louder and the buildings thin out. There's a stake driven into the frozen ground, crooked and worn with age. Beside it, a heavy stone slab. You've heard the stories. This is where shame is nailed down, where names are spoken with a curl of the lip and punishments echo louder than praise. Because in Viking society, love was tolerated, celebrated even, until it crossed the wrong line. And when it did, the consequences weren't just personal. They were public, brutal, and sometimes permanent. Tonight we descend into the darker side of desire, the forbidden kinds, the relationships that didn't just raise eyebrows but triggered legal action, social collapse, or the sharp end of an axe. Some loves were too unconventional, others too inconvenient, and some just dared to happen in the wrong body, or with the wrong person, at the wrong time. Let's start with adultery. Viking society wasn't exactly built on monogamy, as we've already seen, but that didn't mean cheating was free of consequences. If a married woman was caught sleeping with another man, it was a legal offence, and the punishment varied depending on who she was, who he was, and who was mad about it. A scorned husband could take his wife to court. If he won, she might be divorced, stripped of her dowry, publicly shamed, or even beaten. The man she slept with, he might be fined, outlawed, or challenged to a duel. It wasn't about purity, it was about property. A married woman represented her husband's household, honour, and legal alliance. Breaking that bond was seen as theft, not just betrayal. But the reverse? A man cheating on his wife? Technically, it was only considered adultery if the other woman was married too. Sleeping with a thrall or an unmarried woman, while deeply uncool, wasn't illegal. Hypocritical? Definitely. But that's patriarchy for you, even when everyone's wearing wolf pelts and swinging axes. Still, Viking women weren't entirely without recourse. If a husband's infidelity damaged her status or household, she could take legal action, or make his life hell in other more creative ways. Remember, a smart insult at a feast could do more damage than a lawsuit. Reputation mattered, and when shame clung to a name, it clung for generations. Then there were the true taboos, the kinds of love that Viking law didn't just punish, but tried to erase entirely. Same-gender relationships, for example. While the sagas are oddly quiet on this front, some scholars say suspiciously so, the few mentions that exist are wrapped in insult and condemnation, not because of love or attraction, but because of power dynamics. In Viking society, masculinity was defined by dominance, especially sexual dominance. A man who was perceived as taking the passive role in a same-sex relationship was branded ergi, a word that translated roughly to unmanly, cowardly, or even perverted. It wasn't about who you loved, it was about how you were perceived doing it. Being labelled ergi was a legal matter. If someone called you that in public and you didn't respond, it could go to court, or to blood. You had to defend your honour, literally. The insult was serious enough that it could justify a duel. This wasn't about sexual morality. It was about status, control, and the deeply fragile structure of Viking masculinity. That said, not everyone towed the line. The sagas hint at close male friendships that edge into romantic territory. Two warriors who never marry, who die beside each other, whose bond is written with more passion than any heterosexual marriage in the same story. Were they lovers? Roommates? Is it wishful modern reading? Scholars still argue. Some see queerness hidden in the margins. Others think we're projecting. But what's clear is that Viking society had rigid roles, and stepping outside them was dangerous. Now let's talk about cross-dressing. Yes, it happened. And no, it wasn't always funny. the gods did it. Loki, famously, transformed into a woman more than once. Odin practiced cedar, wearing women's clothing and adopting female-coded behaviour to access magic. And while the myths let gods get away with anything, mortals didn't always get the same grace. A man caught dressing as a woman, or adopting feminine roles, risked being called ergi, mocked, fined, or worse. There's a case from a medieval Norse law code where a man is punished for dressing in women's clothing and participating in spinning, which was considered shameful and emasculating. Why? Because gender roles weren't just social, they were cosmic. Mess with them, and you mess with the whole world order. At least that's how it felt. For women, cross-dressing was slightly more accepted, but only in specific contexts. A woman dressing as a man to go to battle. Kinda cool. A woman dressing as a man to seduce another woman or avoid marriage. Less cool. The legendary shield maidens, female warriors, were tolerated because they fought. But if they stepped outside that role into more domestic spaces, the approval faded fast. Be a killer? Sure. Be a boy in a dress? Absolutely not. Here's your fringe fact for the night. There are recorded instances of trial by shame punishments involving cross-dressers. One story tells of a man being paraded through town in a dress, mocked by children, as a way to destroy his social standing. It wasn't about correcting behaviour, it was about erasing someone's dignity. Viking justice could be surgical when it wanted to be. And then there's incest, a taboo so deeply rooted that even the sagas flinch from it. The Norse had strict kinship laws. Marrying too close within your bloodline wasn't just gross, it was illegal. That said, tracing lineage in a world where people constantly moved, changed names, or died young wasn't easy. Mistakes happened. Some sagas feature tragic lovers who only discover their relation after it's too late, and the resolution is usually heartbreak or exile. But the most heartbreaking stories come from the margins, those who loved where they weren't allowed to, who desired in ways that Viking society didn't have words for. We'll never know how many queer Vikings hid their hearts, or how many were punished for feelings they never acted on. The sagas won't tell us, the law codes are silent, the runestones are too proud, and yet, here and there traces remain. A burial site where two women are interred together, arms gently touching. A poem about love that avoids gendered language entirely. A whispered insult that lands just a little too hard. These scraps, these silences speak loudly in their own way. So tonight, as you pass by that old punishment post, carved with names no one says aloud, remember this. Love in Viking society had rules. Break them, and you didn't just risk your heart, you risked your life, your honour, your legacy. But not all forbidden love ended in punishment. Sometimes it ended in power, when sex and ritual collided, and bodies became offerings to the gods themselves. And that's where we're headed next. It's the middle of the night, and yet no one in the village is asleep. Torches blaze along the hilltop path, drums thump in steady rhythm, and a strange humming chant vibrates through the trees. People are gathering, solemn-faced and fur-wrapped, carrying baskets of bread, carved idols, and bundles of fragrant herbs. At the centre of it all, a clearing marked by standing stones, a circle of fire, and something that looks suspiciously like a ceremonial bed. This isn't just a festival, it's a fertility rite. Tonight the gods don't just watch, they participate, and what they demand in return isn't just prayer, it's flesh. Welcome to the strange and often uncomfortable crossroads of religion and sexuality in Viking society. This is where seduction becomes sacred, where sex isn't just for pleasure or procreation, it's an offering, a contract, a ritual gesture flung skyward to keep the world spinning. To understand how deep this connection ran, you have to remember, the Norse didn't divide the sacred and the sensual the way we often do now. For them, fertility wasn't just about crops or wombs, it was about life itself. Success in war, peace between clans, a good harvest, a healthy child, these weren't guaranteed. They were earned, bargained for, sometimes paid for with intimate acts performed under divine eyes. The Vanir gods, Freyja, Freyr, Njord, were especially linked to fertility. Unlike the more warlike Aesir, the Vanir were associated with abundance, sexuality, pleasure, and the cyclical rhythms of nature. It's no coincidence that Freyja, goddess of love and sorcery, was also invoked for childbirth and planting seasons. Her brother Freyr, often depicted with an erect phallus. No, seriously, Archaeologists have found literal fertility statues, represented male virility and the power of life. In some parts of Scandinavia, ceremonial phallic idols were carried through fields before planting to bless the soil. It wasn't subtle, and the rituals weren't metaphorical. During certain festivals, like the springtime varblot or midsummer ceremonies, there's evidence, albeit fragmentary and debated, that sacred sexual rites may have taken place. These could include symbolic unions between a priestess and a man playing the role of the god, mimicking divine copulation to ensure prosperity for the community. Think of it as mythic theatre with very high stakes and no modesty clause. How much of this actually happened? That's where the scholars start sharpening their axes. Some argue that later Christian writers exaggerated or misrepresented these rites to paint Norse paganism as lewd or barbaric. Others believe that while open sexual ritual was likely rare, symbolic versions, offerings of sexual fluids for instance, might have been made to temples or sacred stones. Even if the act itself wasn't performed publicly, the belief that sex had spiritual power was widespread. But it wasn't all solemn drumming and cosmic symbolism. There were blots, sacrificial feasts, where feasting, drinking, and sometimes carnal celebration followed ritual sacrifice. After the animals were offered and the blood was smeared on sacred altars, people partied. And when people party hard enough, someone's bound to wake up next to a stranger. Some scholars suggest that sexual freedom during these festivals was temporarily sanctioned, expected even. Just don't get caught with someone else's wife. Unless, of course, she wanted to be caught. And then there's the temple at Uppsala. Yes, that Uppsala. According to Adam of Bremen, writing in the 11th century, this grand religious site was home to ritual orgies during major festivals. He claims people copulated in the sacred grove as offerings to the gods. But here's the catch. Adam was a Christian bishop writing about pagan neighbours he wanted to discredit. So, maybe grain of salt, or grain of wildly embellished propaganda. Either way, it gives us a window into how sexuality and sacredness were perceived, even distorted by outsiders looking in. Still, sex wasn't just for honouring the gods. It was used in divination and prophecy. The practice of saga, as we've seen, was closely linked to both erotic energy and spiritual insight. Some rituals may have included sexual stimulation or even intercourse to open channels to the divine. The idea was that sexual ecstasy dissolved the self, allowing messages from the gods, or visions of fate, to pass through. Not every vulva performed such rites, but the link between Eros and the unknown was undeniable. Even death got in on the action. Some Viking graves include suggestively arranged bodies, fertility symbols, or grave goods linked to sensual pleasure. Combs, beads, even lubricants. In a culture where death and sex were both portals, one into life, one out, it makes a strange kind of sense that the two might meet again at the end. Now for your fringe fact. In at least one legendary account, a chieftain's daughter is chosen to marry a sacred tree, symbolising a union between the people and the land. The wedding includes ritual singing, wine, and, allegedly, a symbolic consummation involving physical contact with the bark. That's right. The Vikings may have invented tree hugging with benefits. Again, take it with skepticism, but the symbolism is ancient and strangely consistent across cultures. The land itself needs love, and someone has to provide it. So what did this mean for everyday people? It meant that sex wasn't private. It was never just between two people. It rippled outward, through family, community, even the divine. Your body was your own, but also part of a larger system of belief and balance. You could make love for pleasure, yes, but also for magic, for power, or for the sake of the harvest. Of course, not everyone participated in these rituals. Some likely found them unsettling. Others might have leaned into the intoxication, the sense of becoming part of something older and wilder than reason. And some just saw them as a chance to enjoy themselves while blaming the gods if anything went weird. So as the fire burns high in the ceremonial ring and someone steps forward to offer a bundle of wheat, a carved idol, or maybe something more intimate, you understand. For the Norse, the line between sacred and sexual was not a line at all. It was a thread, spun tight and shimmering with sweat, blood and starlight. And just beyond the reach of the firelight, stories are already forming, of broken vows, stolen kisses and love turned deadly. Because next we head into the world of revenge, of blood feuds and the violent fallout of loving the wrong person. You're back in the longhouse, but it doesn't feel safe anymore. The fire crackles like it's angry, the shadows seem to lean in a little closer, and every glance between neighbours feels heavier than before, because someone's gone and done it, fallen in love with the wrong person, or maybe just loved too hard or too recklessly or with too much pride. And in Viking society, when love crossed the wrong line or bruised the wrong ego, it didn't just end in heartbreak, it ended in blood. Welcome to the part of the story where love languages include litigation, sword fights, and slow, simmering revenge. Tonight we're diving into the brutal side of Viking relationships, where emotions weren't whispered in bed but shouted in court, scrawled in blood across land borders, and passed down through generations as curses. Because in this world, who you loved or who you shouldn't have could destroy everything. At the centre of this social minefield was honour. More than love, more than happiness, more than anything, honour governed Viking life. It was your reputation, your currency, your protection. Once damaged, it had to be avenged, and nothing damaged honour quite like scandal, especially romantic or sexual scandal. Sleep with someone's wife, dishonour, reject a high-ranking suitor in favour of someone poorer, humiliation, accuse a man of lacking manhood or sexual potency. That could spark a holmgang, a ritual duel where one or both parties might not walk away. The sagas are littered with examples. In the Njal saga, a minor insult between wives snowballs into an epic feud that results in multiple deaths and the burning of an entire household. It starts with a robe, yes, really, and ends with an inferno. The underlying cause, pride, love, and jealousy twisted into violence. The message is clear: mock a man's household, and you mock him. And mockery, in Viking culture, was a call to war. But even when love didn't spark outright murder, it could still cause chaos. Romantic rivalries, broken betrothals, or rejected proposals could erupt into lawsuits and social division. In a society without police, the legal system was based on compensation, public oaths, and personal enforcement. If someone seduced your daughter, sister, or wife, you didn't file a complaint. You called a thing, the assembly, made your case, and hoped your allies had sharper blades. And if the system failed you, you took justice into your own hands. One saga recounts a man whose betrothed is stolen by another. Rather than challenge him outright, he waits until a feast, lures him outside, and carves a rune into his face, a permanent, shameful reminder of betrayal. He doesn't kill him. He just ruins him socially. Poetic justice, Viking style. Women weren't passive in these dramas either. A wife might pressure her husband to avenge a slight, whispering in his ear until his shame burned hotter than his reason. This isn't just sexist storytelling, it's cultural commentary. In the sagas, women often act as the moral compass, pushing men toward violence when justice feels too slow or too soft, and sometimes they take matters into their own hands. Take the story of Hallgerda Höskuldsdottir, a woman whose beauty and wit are matched only by her capacity for destruction. When her husband slaps her during an argument, she waits and waits. Then, at the perfect moment, she arranges for him to be ambushed and killed. Not immediately, strategically, because Viking revenge wasn't always loud. Sometimes it was cold, quiet, and patient. One of the most famous love revenge arcs comes from the Laxdæla saga, where Gudrun, a fierce and intelligent woman, ends up in a messy love triangle, eventually square really, that involves jealousy, betrayal, duels, and multiple deaths. After her fourth husband dies under murky circumstances, she lives on, silent and unreadable. At the end of her life, she confesses only one truth. The man she loved most was the one she treated worst. And it's devastating. Not just because of the tragedy, but because you realise that love, for all its heat, couldn't outmatch the cold grip of honour. Let's not pretend all of this was unique to the Norse. Cultures across time and geography have punished forbidden love. But the Vikings added their own special brand of grim poetry, mixing lore, myth, and violence until every affair felt like a saga. And because storytelling was how they preserved identity, these tales of vengeance became lessons, warnings, even entertainment. Want to woo a rival's wife? Expect to see your name on a gravestone, or worse, a nidstang, a cursed pole carved with insults and magical symbols, erected to publicly shame you. Here's your fringe fact for the night. There are recorded cases of Vikings using carved animal skulls impaled on stakes, sometimes with runes and bones attached, to curse or shame a romantic rival. Basically, medieval subtweets but with livestock. These were left at property lines or crossroads to send a very clear message: you've crossed me, and the gods are watching. Modern scholars still argue over how literal these tales are. Were all Viking love feuds truly this dramatic, or are the sagas exaggerating for flair? Some believe they reflect real cases, shaped into legends. Others see them as cautionary tales, designed to uphold social rules by showing the fallout when emotions boil over. Either way, the underlying message stays the same. In Viking society, love had boundaries. Cross them, and you triggered a chain reaction that might end in blood. And it wasn't always about romance. Sometimes it was love for a friend, a sibling, a child, and the pain of losing them, or watching them be dishonoured, sparked wars. Because love wasn't private here. It was political. Every union, every betrayal, every whispered insult had weight. You didn't just risk heartbreak. You risked your lineage, your farm, your legacy. So tonight, as the drums quiet and the moon rises, you listen to the silence of a village that has seen too many feuds. Somewhere, someone still grieves. Somewhere else, someone still sharpens their blade. And somewhere, someone's whispering a name that once meant love and now means war. Next, we head back to the sea, into the tight-knit world of Viking ships, where men spent months together in close quarters, bound by blood, oaths, and something deeper. A kind of love that didn't always have a name, but definitely had a heartbeat. The longship rocks gently beneath your feet, the sound of the sea slapping the hull like an old lullaby with a sharp rhythm. There's salt on your tongue, calluses on your hands, and the smell of sweat, fish, and damp wool in your nose. You're surrounded by other men, brothers, cousins, warriors, merchants, killers, friends, crammed shoulder to shoulder in a vessel that might as well be a floating coffin if the weather turns. You've been out here for weeks. You've seen each other bleed, vomit, cry, laugh, and sleep with your mouths open. And somewhere between the shared hardships and the silence of open water, something unspoken has taken root. This is the realm of Viking bro culture, the sea-bound, tightly wound world of masculine bonds that went far deeper than simple camaraderie. Here, loyalty wasn't just a virtue, it was survival. And sometimes, that loyalty slipped into tenderness. Sometimes it became love. And sometimes it crossed lines that Viking lore couldn't name, but everyone quietly understood. Let's be honest, Viking ships weren't luxurious. Longships were narrow, open-decked, and barely large enough to stretch out without bumping into someone's foot or helmet. Privacy didn't exist. You ate together, pissed over the side together, and slept in tangled piles when the wind turned vicious. Days blurred together, row, sail, repair, repeat. You learned to read your crewmates like weather signs. A twitch meant irritation, a glance meant warning, a laugh at the wrong time could mean a knife in the ribs by dawn. But alongside the tension came intimacy, the kind born not of softness, but of shared experience. The sagas and poems, though rarely sentimental, hint at this closeness. Comrades who trust each other more than their wives, warriors who defend each other even when their own families demand revenge, men who choose exile together rather than live apart. These aren't just battle buddies. These are bonds that feel suspiciously like something deeper. And while the sagas almost never describe romantic relationships between men outright, they leave enough breadcrumbs to make you wonder. Consider the tale of Gunnar and Njal, two warriors whose friendship becomes central to Njal's saga. They sleep under the same roof, raise each other's children, and refuse to take up arms against one another, even as the rest of their world erupts into violence. Their devotion is intense, emotional, sacrificial, profound. Does it ever become sexual? The saga won't say. Maybe it doesn't need to. Modern scholars debate this constantly. Some argue that Viking masculinity had space for emotional closeness between men without implying sex. Others believe that queerness existed under a veil of unspoken acceptance, as long as the public roles weren't threatened. In other words, it's fine to love a man, even physically, as long as you don't act like the passive one. Because that's the line Viking society was obsessed with. The term ergi, you remember this, meant something like unmanly or shameful. It wasn't about being gay per se, it was about being dominated. A man who allowed himself to be penetrated, metaphorically or literally, was seen as weak, dishonourable, less. But what if you loved another man and didn't cross that line? What if the line wasn't where people said it was? Here's where things get hazy. Viking culture, for all its brutality, was not as emotionally repressed as you might think. Men wept openly. They composed poetry for each other. They kissed comrades in greeting. They sang laments when their companions died. One skaldic verse, written after a warrior's death, reads like a love letter soaked in blood and seawater. I held his hand. Now the sea holds him slash. My shield is cold without him beside me. That's not just grief. That's devotion. And it exists in a culture that rarely allowed men to express vulnerability, unless it came wrapped in battle or brotherhood. So it's entirely possible that romantic or even erotic feelings between Viking men existed quietly, framed not as sin or scandal, but as something ineffable, something beyond the need to name. And the ship was the crucible. You couldn't fake brotherhood at sea. You earned it, suffered through it, and sometimes broke under it. There are stories, unconfirmed naturally, of men disappearing together after voyages, abandoning land-bound lives to become wanderers, sharing whatever coin they earned, living as a pair until age or war separated them. Were they lovers? Were they just too weary for anything else? The sagas stay silent, but the silence speaks volumes. Here's your fringe detail for tonight. Archaeologists in Sweden uncovered a Viking burial site where two male skeletons were interred together, side by side, with shared grave goods: one sword, one set of armour, two drinking horns. It's not definitive evidence of a romantic relationship, but it's unusual. Most Viking burials are strictly hierarchical. Master and thrall, husband and wife, parent and child. This one? Equal, intentional, intimate. It could be coincidence, or it could be the only monument two men ever got to each other. But it wasn't all unspoken tenderness. Sometimes closeness curdled. Betrayal between bonded men was considered especially shameful, almost worse than betrayal between spouses. One saga tells of a warrior who betrays his sworn brother by revealing a secret love affair. He's not just condemned, he's cursed. Another story involves a rejected friendship that spirals into obsession, then murder. The emotional stakes were sky high, because when love hides behind loyalty, the fallout is even more explosive. So tonight, as the ship rocks and the stars blur overhead, you glance at the man next to you. He's asleep, mouth open, one arm slung over his axe. You've fought beside him, bled with him, laughed with him. You'd kill for him. Maybe you already have. And in this moment you wonder, just for a second, what that means. What it could mean, if the world allowed it. But tomorrow the sea will rise and you'll row again, and no one will speak of softness, only strength, only survival, only the next raid, the next fire, the next storm. And yet, part of you will remember this stillness, this closeness, this quiet moment before the wind turns. Next, we step ashore and search for longing carved in wood and stone, because even Vikings left love notes, and some of them were weirdly sweet. The storm has passed, and the sea is behind you now, just a whisper at your back. You're walking through a quiet village, not a soul in sight, only the soft creak of wooden beams and the hush of the wind weaving through the thatched rooftops. Then you see it, a carved message on the doorframe of a boathouse, rough but deliberate. Runes, not a warning or a prayer, a name, and just beneath it, a phrase. I long for your voice in the morning. It's not a curse, it's not a threat. It's a love note scratched into pine centuries before anyone thought to call it romantic. And suddenly, you're not so sure the Vikings were as emotionally repressed as their battle axes might suggest. Welcome to the softer side of Norse life, still sharp around the edges, but tender where you least expect it. Tonight, we search for signs of longing not in saga showdowns or sword fights, but in the graffiti left behind. Because even warriors got heartsick, and sometimes they wrote it down. Let's start with runes. More than just letters, runes were symbols of immense power, carved into stones, weapons, jewellery, and bones. Every stroke had weight. Every word carved was meant to last. And while many runestones commemorate the dead, proclaim land rights, or mark religious sites, a few, the rare few, speak of something else entirely. Something aching, personal, and unmistakably romantic. On a piece of birch bark found in what is now Novgorod, Russia, once a bustling hub of Norse trade, Archaeologists uncovered a letter written by a boy named Onfim in the 13th century. He was likely learning to write, practicing his letters and drawing pictures. In one note he scrawls, "I am Onfim, greet me." Not exactly Shakespeare, but give the kid a break. He was 10. What matters is the instinct, to name himself, to reach out. It's communication as a form of intimacy. Even at that age, something in him wanted to be seen. Far more stirring is a carved piece of wood found in Bergen, Norway. Dated to around 1200 CE, the inscription reads, "My love, kiss me, you are my desire." It's simple, blunt, a little breathless, and it shatters the idea that all Viking emotions were buried under layers of frostbite and stoicism. Someone held that piece of wood in shaking hands, pressed their knife to the surface, and left a confession behind. Other inscriptions are playful, even flirtatious. One found on a wooden stick says, "You will lose your maidenhead if you linger near me." Classic Viking pickup line, delivered via tree branch. Somewhere between crude graffiti and desperate poetry, it says more than it means to. About how humour and desire walked hand in hand, even in societies built on conquest and code. Of course, not all runic love notes were charming. Some were desperate, others veered into obsession. One fragment reads, "I carve these runes in longing. May they reach you, if the gods allow." No name, no address, just words tossed into fate's hands like a bottle thrown into the sea. We don't know if it was ever read, but it exists, etched, not whispered, which is kind of perfect for a people who believe that words held literal magic. You see, Vikings didn't trust speech the way they trusted stone and steel. Spoken words could be twisted. Carved ones? Those stayed. To write something in runes was to solidify it, make it real, sometimes dangerously so. Love runes were a known thing, as we've discussed, and not always welcome. Carving a rune for someone without their consent could be considered invasive, even cursed, and if it didn't work, if your love still turned away, you risked looking like a fool and inviting the gods' scorn. So these love notes, when they happened, were risks, emotional vulnerability in a culture where weakness was blood in the water, and yet people still did it. Left messages under doorframes, etched symbols into gifts, wrote verses in the margins of trade ledgers and scraps of bone. One wooden tag, essentially a Norse luggage label, was found with the inscription, "Send this with love to my girl." Not exactly, "I would die for you," but in a world where literal dying happened all the time, it carries weight. Here's your fringe fact for the night. In a few rare cases, love messages have been found on weapons. One sword, likely ceremonial, bears a runic line that translates roughly to "she waits for me." No name, no further detail. Just a promise, etched into steel as if to say, "Yes, I might die, but she'll know I remembered her." That's the kind of sentiment that makes even a hardened raider a little soft around the eyes. The scholars go back and forth on these finds. Some argue that we're reading too much into simple marks, seeing poetry where there's just bookkeeping. Others insist we're only scratching the surface of a vast, undocumented emotional life that Vikings carried like hidden wounds beneath their armour. After all, not everything made it into the sagas. Those stories were shaped, curated, often written down centuries later by Christian scribes with their own priorities. The raw stuff, the whispers and stumbles and quiet yearnings, that's what got left behind in bone, bark and wood. And that's why these little carvings matter. They weren't meant for anyone but the person who would read them. Not for historians, not for poets, just one heart trying to reach another, and that makes them priceless. So tonight, as you trace your fingers over one of these ancient messages, try to imagine the hand that carved it. Rough fingers, a knife dulled from years of use, a pause before the first stroke, maybe a glance over the shoulder to make sure no one was watching, and then a single line etched forever. In a world of noise and violence, this was their version of "I miss you." But don't get too sentimental, because love wasn't the only thing that got carved into wood. Sometimes it was the law. And next, we're diving into the cold, hard rules that governed hearts, and what happened when those rules were broken. You're sitting in the coldest room you've ever been in, a drafty meeting hall, packed with angry men, fur cloaks, and the overwhelming smell of wet wool and stale mead. At the centre of the room, a law speaker stands, his voice steady and ancient, reciting legal phrases from memory like they're sacred scripture. On one side of the hall, a woman clutches her shawl, lips pressed tight. On the other, A soon-to-be former husband stares into the floorboards like they might forgive him. This isn't a trial about theft or murder, it's about feelings, or more specifically the breakdown of marriage, the question of property, and whether the goat goes with her or him. This is love, Viking style, administered with the precision of law and the emotional finesse of a battle axe. Tonight, we're crawling into the cold, rigid bones of Viking legal codes. The quiet, precise framework that underpinned every relationship, every marriage, every betrayal and divorce. Because as much as Viking culture gave space for passion and poetry, it was also obsessed with rules. If you thought you could love whoever you wanted, however you wanted, without consequence, well, the Gragas would like a word. Let's start with the basics. Viking law, especially in places like Iceland and Norway, had detailed guidelines for marriage, divorce, infidelity and property division. These weren't back-of-the-scroll notes either. They were publicly recited at the Thing, the legal assembly, etched into memory and practice, and designed to prevent one thing above all: social instability. Love might be unpredictable. The law wasn't allowed to be. Marriage, as we've covered, was more contract than romance. And because it involved land, livestock and inheritance, it was heavily regulated. You couldn't just shack up with someone because you liked the way they swung an axe. There were requirements. The bride had to be freeborn, of legal age and not too closely related. Both families had to agree, and once the mundr, the groom's gift, was paid and the feast held, the deal was done. But here's where it gets interesting. Viking women had legal leverage. If a marriage broke down, through violence, neglect, or straight-up incompatibility, a woman could initiate divorce. And she didn't need to prove adultery or betrayal. She could simply state her grievances in front of witnesses and walk. There were a few standard phrases for this. One translated roughly to, "I separate from you because I do not wish to be married to you." That's it. No courts, no begging, just a declaration and a line drawn in frostbitten turf. Of course, there were conditions. The woman had to return any shared property that wasn't hers. She kept her dowry, unless she was the one found guilty of dishonour. And if children were involved, custody wasn't automatically awarded. Both families might stake a claim, and that often turned into a legal nightmare. But still, for a woman in the year 1000 CE to be able to leave a marriage without permission, that was radical. Now, about adultery. As far as the law was concerned, a married woman caught cheating could be divorced instantly. Her husband could even demand compensation from her lover, known as vidrally. But if the situation was reversed, if the husband was the unfaithful one, he didn't face legal penalties unless he'd slept with a married woman. The law didn't care if he had a side piece, as long as she was free and single. Double standard? You bet. Common? Absolutely. Still, even a man could get legally humiliated. If a wife could prove her husband was impotent or failed to provide for her, she could demand divorce and take her property back. In one case, a man was ridiculed for not consummating his marriage, and his wife publicly mocked his performance before walking out. The court sided with her, so while the legal scales were tilted, they weren't bolted to the floor. And here's the twist. The Vikings didn't just punish sexual misconduct. They punished how you talked about it. Publicly accusing someone of being unmanly or sexually submissive, those old ergy insults, could lead to legal action. These weren't casual slurs, they were fighting words, and if you didn't challenge them, your reputation was wrecked. Which meant that insinuation was a dangerous weapon. Gossip could be as fatal as a sword. The laws also included penalties for betrothal fraud, promising someone in marriage, then backing out after payment had been made. It was called Brenna Brudlaup, or burning the wedding. The scorned party could sue for damages, and this wasn't theoretical. Sagas describe men dueling over broken engagements, families going to war over cancelled weddings, and entire settlements getting dragged into what started as a flirtation gone wrong. Here's your fringe fact for the night. In some parts of Viking Scandinavia, the Thing included a designated stone, called a skamstapi, where legal insults could be shouted publicly, provided you followed the proper format. That's right, there was a legally appropriate way to insult someone, as long as you did it in verse and named witnesses. Basically, it was Viking Twitter, but with actual consequences. So what happens when love turns violent? When a partner harms the other? Viking law took physical abuse seriously, at least on paper. A man who beat his wife without cause could face public shame, fines, or retaliation from her family. If he maimed or killed her, he might be outlawed, banished from the community, stripped of property and protection. And outlawry wasn't just social exile, it was a death sentence. Anyone could kill you, and no one would be punished for it. Of course, in practice, justice wasn't always fair. Powerful men could buy silence, bend the law or intimidate witnesses. Poorer women might have no allies to defend them, but the framework existed, and that matters. It meant that, theoretically, the law acknowledged the importance of consent, fairness, and personal safety. Not perfect, but not absent either. Modern scholars still wrestle with the gap between Viking law and Viking reality. The codes look progressive in some ways, but how often were they followed? How many women actually divorced their husbands without consequence? How many men were punished for emotional cruelty or coercion, or breaking hearts in quieter ways? We may never know. But the laws themselves offer a glimpse into what the Vikings valued: stability, clarity, and honour. Love was fine, great even, but only if it played by the rules. So tonight, as the law speaker finishes reciting the fine print of someone's shattered marriage, and the witnesses nod solemnly, and the jilted husband storms out into the snow, you're left thinking. For a society so wild, so violent, so emotional, it cared a lot about paperwork, about who owed what, about where the line was and what happened if you stepped over it. And if you died while still loving someone or still resenting them, well, the law was done with you. But the afterlife wasn't, because next we follow the lovers into the ground to see what they took with them, who they took with them, and what their graves say when no one's left to argue. It's quiet now, deeply quiet, the kind that feels carved into the earth itself. You're standing on a wind-blown hill, the grass flattened in frozen waves, overlooking a burial mound older than memory. The stones are uneven, slumped like sleeping shoulders, and the entrance is sealed, but you can feel what's beneath, someone's story, locked in shadow. Maybe they were a farmer, a warrior, a weaver. Maybe they were loved. Maybe they weren't, but their grave holds clues of who they were, who they cared about, and sometimes who they were buried with. Because in Viking society, death didn't erase love, it redefined it. Tonight we sink into the cold soil and dig into the rituals of Viking burial, specifically how love, sex and relationships followed people beyond the veil. From grave goods that hint at romance, to exes sent off together in permanent awkward silence, to sacrifices made in the name of loyalty or power, the Viking afterlife was crowded with emotional baggage. Let's unpack it. Start with the basics. Viking burials were elaborate, varied, and deeply symbolic. You could be buried in a ship, under a mound, in a shallow pit, or even cremated and scattered at sea. The dead were sent off with care: clothing, jewellery, weapons, combs, tools, food, drink, and occasionally, other people. Not metaphorical, you'll live on in our memories, people. Actual bodies, sometimes alive, sometimes not for long. The most famous case of this, the Osberg burial. Found in Norway, it held two women, one older, one younger, laid out in a richly furnished ship grave with an almost obscene level of wealth. Tapestries, carved sleds, animal bones, wagons, textiles and more. Scholars still debate their relationship. Were they noblewoman and servant, priestess and initiate, mother and daughter, or something more intimate? Some believe the younger woman may have been sacrificed to accompany the elder. Others think they died together, perhaps from plague. But the way their bodies were arranged, side by side in mirrored rest, suggests closeness, a bond honoured in death. And the Osberg find isn't alone. There are other graves with pairs, male and female, sometimes same-sex, sometimes unclear, with personal items that suggest shared domestic life. One grave in Gotland held a man and woman with matching brooches, a shared necklace, and a cooking pot placed right between them. It's easy to imagine them bickering over that pot in life. Now it belongs to both of them, forever. Romantic or tragic? Probably both. But then it gets darker, because not all those buried with the dead were exactly willing. In some graves, particularly among the wealthy or warrior elite, evidence suggests that servants, slaves, or lovers were killed and placed in the tomb, a practice known as retainer sacrifice. The dead needed company after all, someone to serve them, comfort them, or, let's be honest, entertain them in the afterlife. One chilling example, the ship burial at Salme, Estonia, where 10 men were buried with their weapons and ornaments. Several had healed battle wounds, clearly seasoned warriors. 2 had crushed skulls, likely killed during the burial ritual. Were they honoured comrades, or offerings to guide the dead into the next world? Depends who you ask. Either way, their deaths weren't incidental. They were part of the performance. In some rare cases, women were the sacrificed ones. In the famous account by Ahmad ibn Fadlan, a 10th century Arab diplomat visiting the Rus, a Norse-influenced people, he describes a slave girl who volunteers to die with her deceased master. The account is graphic: ritual washing, alcohol, symbolic sex acts, and ultimately her being stabbed and laid beside him in the burning ship. It's horrifying. It's also debated. Some argue Ibn Fadlan exaggerated for effect. Others say he got it mostly right, and that ritual death in the name of loyalty or love, twisted as it is, was part of elite funerary culture. But let's not get too swept up in the blood and fire. Many Viking graves reflect quieter, gentler choices. Trinkets that hint at memory. A lock of hair from a spouse. A comb carved with initials. Grave goods weren't just status symbols. They were emotional echoes. If you buried your lover with a shared cup, or your child with a favourite toy, that wasn't ritual. That was grief. Some graves have no clear indicators of marriage or kinship, just shared space. A man and woman, unrelated, buried side by side with no visible power imbalance. Did they love each other? Were they friends? Was it platonic cohabitation in the afterlife? We'll never know. But the care in the burial, the positioning of hands, the arrangement of objects, tells us something deeper. Connection mattered, even after death. And then there are the outliers, the graves that feel like rebukes. One man in Sweden was buried face down, arms twisted behind him. No goods, no ceremony. Archaeologists believe he was punished, cast out, maybe even cursed. Some say he violated sexual norms, slept with the wrong person, crossed a line the community couldn't forgive, so they erased him. Here's your fringe fact for tonight. In some Icelandic sagas, it's said that the dead could return to haunt those who wronged them in love. Not out of revenge, but longing, a restless yearning. The Draugr, undead revenants, were often driven by unresolved emotion, desire that wouldn't die. In these stories, love doesn't end at the grave. It curdles, it hunts. And modern scholars, they're split as always. Some argue that Viking burial practices were more about status than sentiment, that grave pairings don't imply romance, only hierarchy. Others push back, pointing to the small, quiet gestures buried among the grandeur. A necklace shared, a rune etched into bone, 2 heads tilted toward each other, not away. What's clear is this: the Vikings understood that death didn't delete relationships, it preserved them, froze them in time. If you loved someone, truly loved them, you might make sure they came with you, or at least that something of them did. So tonight, as the wind howls across the burial mound and snow begins to fall in slow, heavy flakes, you imagine lying beside someone. Not in passion, not in pain, just presence, shared silence, shared rest. But don't get too comfortable, because not all love was content to be buried. Some of it ran wild into forests and hidden places, where rules didn't reach and secrets thrived, and that's where we're headed next. The village fades behind you as you slip into the tree line, branches clawing gently at your cloak. The air colder and somehow quieter than it should be. The path is overgrown, but you follow it anyway, deeper and deeper into the woods, past moss-covered stones, a stream whispering through roots, the rustle of deer disappearing just out of sight. This isn't just a forest, it's a boundary, between what's allowed and what's tolerated, between the public eye and private risk. Because out here, far from the longhouse and the thing and all those watching eyes, love took on different shapes, secret shapes, sometimes sacred, sometimes scandalous, always hidden. Tonight we're entering the wilderness, both literal and emotional, of Viking society, a place for trysts, rites, and forbidden rendezvous. The forest was a playground, a sanctuary, a stage for desire that couldn't be contained within the rigid walls of clan life. When the laws grew too tight and the hearth too crowded, people stepped into the trees to find something they couldn't name in public. Something dangerous. Something necessary. Let's start with the obvious: privacy. The Viking longhouse, as we've seen, was a communal space. No rooms, no secrets, and definitely no romantic getaways. So where did people go when they wanted to be alone? Out here. The woods were freedom, and not just for the married couple sneaking off to reignite something lost in the din of daily life. Young people met here. Lovers from feuding families, secret flings between unequals, masters and thralls, men and men, or women whose marriages had long since died behind closed curtains. The forest swallowed noise, and it didn't judge. These were more than just hookup spots. They were also places of ritual. Fertility rites, especially, often took place in the woods, among the trees, the spirits, the ancestors, and whatever god happened to be watching. You didn't perform sacred acts in your turnip patch. You did it where the veil was thinner, where the land itself seemed more alive. Some accounts speak of Völur, Norse seeresses, leading rituals in groves dedicated to Freyr or Freya, the god and goddess of fertility. Offerings would be made, chants sung, and in some cases acts of symbolic union performed. Whether this involved literal sex or something more theatrical is still debated, but the implication is there. The forest didn't just hide shame, it amplified power. Then there's the matter of Udaceta, which translates roughly to sitting out, a spiritual practice in which someone, usually a seer or someone seeking a vision, would go alone into the wild, sit on a grave or sacred hill, and wait for revelation. But Udaceta wasn't always solitary. Some sagas suggest that lovers used the practice as a cover, sneaking away together under the pretense of seeking guidance, only to seek each other instead. And here's where the secrecy turns charged. Because not all forest love stories were consensual. In some sagas, the woods are a place of abduction, where warriors kidnap potential brides, or where a woman flees her home only to be followed. The line between romantic elopement and outright theft is blurred, and that's no accident. Viking culture romanticized certain kinds of danger. But the reality, of course, was more complicated, and often more violent. Still, many forest meetings weren't about power or dominance. They were about escape, about craving a version of love that didn't fit the rules back home. The young daughter of a chieftain sneaking off to meet the blacksmith's son. Two men hiding their affection behind hunting trips that never seemed to yield much meat. A wife and her thrall, drawn to each other not by lust but by years of quiet familiarity. Eyes meeting too long while folding linen. These were not sanctioned stories, but they were real, and the forest kept their secrets. There's a tale, quiet, nearly forgotten, about a woman who falls in love with her husband's sister. She doesn't act on it, not openly. But she follows her into the woods during berry season. They sit together in silence, hands occasionally brushing as they reach for the same fruit. Nothing is said. Nothing needs to be. That moment, unspoken, is all they'll ever have. It's not in a saga, it's in a scrap of oral tradition recorded centuries later by someone who didn't know what to make of it. But it lingers. Here's your fringe fact for tonight. Some runestones and carvings have been found deep in forests miles from settlements, with messages that suggest private dedications. Not religious markers, not property lines, just names, initials, phrases like "he waits for me here" or "our spring." Were these lovers' spots, memorials to secret relationships? We'll never know, but someone took the time to carve them, in a place no one else would look. That matters. And of course not every forest meeting was safe. Some ended in betrayal, blackmail, or blood. If you were caught, the penalties could be brutal. A woman found pregnant outside of marriage might be exiled. A man discovered in bed with another man's wife could be outlawed, or worse, killed on the spot. The woods offered privacy, but not protection. They were sacred and savage in equal measure. Still, people kept returning, because sometimes secrecy was the only option. If your love couldn't survive the light of day, you brought it here. Let the leaves cover your footsteps. Let the birds drown out your voices. Let the moss remember your touch when the world chose to forget. Scholars continue to debate how prevalent these forest encounters were, whether we're projecting modern romanticism onto a culture more concerned with livestock and land deals. But oral tradition, archaeological traces, and the patterns in saga omissions all point to a truth. Not all love was public, and not all of it died because it had to hide. So tonight, as the moon filters through the branches and the forest hums with 1,000 secret lives, you listen. There, just at the edge of hearing, a laugh, a sigh. two voices speaking in the hush of knowing they are alone, if only for now. And when the sun rises, and they return to the village as strangers again, the forest will remember. It always does. Next, we follow the whispers even deeper, into prophecy, priestesses, and the erotic undercurrents of Viking visions. Because when the gods spoke, they didn't always use words. The ground changes beneath your feet, soft moss giving way to something harder, stranger. A ring of stones, unnaturally round. A single pole rises from the centre, carved with runes so old they look like cracks in the wood. This isn't a place you just find. It's a place you're brought to, called to. The air here is different, heavier, as if the sky's pressing down on it. And she's already here, cloaked, silent, eyes rimmed in kohl and shadow, with a staff in one hand and a memory in the other. She is a Völva, seeress, prophet, and spiritual gatekeeper of Viking society. And when she speaks, people listen, because what she sees often involves war, fate, death, and yes, love. Tonight, we move into the realm of prophecy and vision, where the future wasn't just something to guess at, but something to feel, to summon, to touch. And like everything else in the Viking world, it was laced with sex, power, and ritual. The divine didn't whisper sweet nothings. It whispered things you didn't always want to hear, through symbols, through dreams, and sometimes through the body. Let's talk about Cedar. This wasn't just future-telling. It was an entire category of magic, one that blurred lines between gender, desire, and identity. The practitioner, often a woman, entered a trance through ritual, chanting and sometimes physical stimulation, becoming a vessel through which the gods could speak. This wasn't done in temples or churches. It happened on mounds, hills, forest clearings, out in the open, under stars and silence. But here's where things get thorny. Cedar was considered inherently feminine, and when men practiced it, it raised eyebrows. Odin, the Allfather himself, was said to have learned Cedar from Freya, but doing so cost him his masculine reputation in the eyes of mortals. Practicing this kind of magic meant giving yourself over, becoming receptive, soft, ecstatic. In a culture obsessed with dominance, this was taboo, and yet, power lived there. The Völva wasn't mocked. She was feared, respected, sought after. If a chieftain wanted to know if his marriage would last, or whether his son's strange affections were signs of divine calling or simple deviation, he went to her. If a woman couldn't conceive, or a man couldn't get it up, the Völva had answers. Sometimes they were wrapped in metaphor, sometimes not. We have descriptions, fragments of these rituals. The Völva would sit on a raised seat surrounded by women singing incantations. She would enter a trance. Her body might shake, her breathing change. Some accounts describe sexual energy in the space. Raw, ambient, unspoken, but undeniable. Not orgies, not vulgarity. Something subtler. As if calling the gods required touching a part of yourself normally kept under lock and key. And here's the part scholars still argue about. Did Viking prophecy use sex as a medium? Was erotic energy a pathway to vision? We'll never know for sure, but hints abound. Some sagas describe love spells that had to be performed during arousal. Others mention carved charms placed under beds, or buried beneath doorways to stir desire or loyalty. There's even mention of drinking love potions during divination, to dream of a future spouse or rekindle a fading connection. Then there's Galdr, a different kind of magic performed through chanting and song. While not inherently sexual, the way it was described, rhythmic, repetitive, often performed in isolation, feels deeply physical. Practitioners would chant themselves into altered states, into knowledge, and sometimes into visions of lovers not yet met. One poem, Skinnismal, tells of a god's servant performing magic to seduce a reluctant woman. The spell is forceful, disturbing. It reflects a darker truth. Not all love magic was consensual, just like not all Viking relationships were. The boundary between magic and manipulation was thin, especially when the heart was involved. But not all prophetic love was shadowy. There's a legend of a woman who dreamed of her future husband every night for 7 winters. She never told anyone. When he arrived, travel-stained and late to a feast, she looked at him once and said, "You're late." They married the next day. Is it romanticized? Sure. But even so, the idea lingers. Love could be known before it was lived. Here's your fringe fact for tonight. A rare amulet was found in Denmark carved with a love incantation written backward. Scholars believe it was meant to be read in a mirror, or by spirits. It wasn't for human eyes. The words translate roughly to, "Let him burn with wanting." It's the oldest version of a thirst trap, only it was aimed at fate itself. Of course, prophecy wasn't always kind. Some visions ended marriages before they began. He will stray, she will die young, their love will bring war. And once seen, those futures stuck. Even if the people tried to defy them, the community wouldn't forget. It's hard to love someone when everyone around you is waiting for it to end in fire. Still, people kept seeking answers, because the heart, even wrapped in fur and frost, still wanted to believe it had a path, that the gods had plans, that destiny might leave a love note behind. Modern scholars? Mixed bag. Some think all this talk of love in prophecy is modern projection. Others point to consistent themes, dreams of union, rituals of longing, carved symbols tied to romantic outcomes. The truth is probably somewhere in between. Love was never the focus of prophecy, but it was always lurking, like a shadow behind the flame. So tonight, as the vulva finally opens her eyes and whispers your future into the cold night air, you feel something stir. Not fear, not hope, something else, a recognition. That even in a world ruled by steel and storm, the gods still spoke of desire, still moved through bodies, still wrote strange and messy love stories, just not in ink. And next, we return from the mystic back to the mundane, but with sharper eyes. Because now we know what to look for in the sagas, the hidden gestures, the longing glances, the unspoken truths tucked between the lines. And that's exactly where we're headed. You're sitting by a fire again, but this one's different. No actual smoke, no wet wool drying by the flames. This fire is made of words. Someone across from you begins to speak, their voice rich and slow, like mead poured into a carved horn. It's an old story, one you've maybe heard before, heroes, battles, glory. But something catches your ear. A pause, a look, a line delivered just a bit too gently. You lean in, and there it is. Quiet, hidden, deliberate. A love story slipped between sword strikes and vengeance oaths. In Viking sagas, love didn't always shout. Sometimes it whispered from the margins. Tonight we're digging into those very margins, the sagas, the epics, the poetic fragments that form the heart of Norse storytelling. Because while most of them weren't about love and sex, they weren't afraid to touch it either. You just have to know where to look, and once you do, you'll see it everywhere. Tangled in bloodlines, wrapped in riddles, nestled awkwardly between marriage alliances and murder plots. Let's start with Laxdæla saga, a favourite among scholars who crave emotional carnage. It tells the story of Gudrun Osvifusdottir, one of the most complex women in all of Old Norse literature. She's beautiful, ambitious, and cursed to love and lose. Over the course of the saga, she marries 4 different men, none of whom quite match the man she can't have. Kjartan. Their relationship is intense, passionate, thwarted by pride and miscommunication. She ends up married to his cousin Bolli instead. Bolli eventually kills Kjartan, and Gudrun years later confesses to a priest that the man she loved most was the one she treated worst. It's devastating, quiet, and entirely relatable. No gods, no spells, just the ache of knowing you wrecked something precious. That kind of emotional nuance wasn't common in medieval literature, and yet, there it is, right in the middle of a saga that also includes axe fights and legal disputes. Other sagas give us different flavours of love, like Cormac's saga, where a poet-warrior falls in love with a woman named Steingrdr. Their relationship is intense, poetic, and absolutely doomed. Cormac composes verse after verse for her, but their bond is constantly disrupted by fate, family drama, and his own hot-headedness. They never marry, never quite get there. But his poems survive, aching, vivid, full of lust and longing. If Cormac were alive today, he'd be the guy texting you, thinking about you at 2 a.m. after ghosting you for a week. Then there's Gisli's saga, where the titular character's wife, Orda, stays fiercely loyal to him even after he's outlawed. She smuggles him food, protects his hideouts, risking her life again and again. It's not dramatic passion, it's quiet, enduring commitment, and in a culture that prized stoicism, that kind of slow-burning loyalty was romantic. Vikings weren't writing sonnets about candlelit dinners. They were honouring the woman who crossed a snowstorm to bring bread to her outlawed husband. What's fascinating is how often love in the sagas ends badly. Like, almost always, lovers are separated, betrayed, manipulated, or die violently. Sometimes all of the above. It wasn't just drama, it was a worldview. The Norse didn't expect happy endings. Fate, word, Urdiar, whatever you want to call it, was always waiting around the corner with a club. So when love appeared in a saga, it was usually bittersweet. Beautiful, yes, but fleeting, dangerous. And this might be why Viking storytellers tucked their love stories between the lines, because love wasn't the main plot. It was a complication, a vulnerability, something that made warriors hesitate, made people lie, made heroes fall. That said, the poetry, that's where the feelings come out swinging. Skaldic and Eddic verse is loaded with desire, metaphor-heavy, sure, but undeniably emotional. Poets compared their lovers' eyes to glacial rivers, their skin to newly forged silver. Kisses were described as the meeting of fjords. And sex. Well, that got a bit earthier. There are verses that straight up brag about conquests, some veiled, some explicit. One goes so far as to describe a woman's moans as being sweeter than mead in my beard. No subtlety, just horny bard energy. And don't overlook the women poets. Yes, they existed. Not many, but a few verses survive from female skalds, often about longing, betrayal, or erotic dreams. One poem, attributed to a woman named Joran, speaks of a man's touch as something sent from the gods. It's not flowery, it's raw, and it holds its own against the better-known male verses. Now here's your fringe fact. Some scholars believe certain sagas were edited in the Christian era to remove or soften queer elements. Friendship turned into brotherhood. Devotion between same-sex characters recast as platonic loyalty. It's speculative, but plausible. Old Norse society had complex views on masculinity and social roles. But feelings? Those don't always fit neatly into translation. Sometimes love slips through the redactions, and that's the scholarly debate, really. Are we reading too much into these stories? Projecting modern ideas onto ancient texts? Maybe. But sometimes the emotional resonance is too sharp to ignore. When someone writes a poem about missing a woman's voice more than food or sleep, you don't need a degree in medieval literature to know what's going on. So tonight, as the storyteller across the fire reaches the end of their tale, voice hushed, the final line lingering like breath on a window, you realise the love was never the loud part. It was the pause, the look, the silence after a name, the part that makes you ache even after the swords are sheathed and the mead is poured. And next, we leave the stories and step back into the real world, to the firesides and bedrolls where all of this actually happened. What did intimacy look like? What did it feel like? Because it wasn't all prophecy and poetry. Sometimes it was just awkward fumbling under a fur blanket. The fire is low now, just embers, soft red and pulsing like a heartbeat beneath ash. Around you, the longhouse has quieted. People are wrapped in furs, snoring or muttering in sleep, bodies tucked along the benches and tucked into corners. You can hear the wind trying to slip through the cracks in the wall. And right next to you, someone shifts beneath the blanket, warm skin brushing against yours, a breath caught in the chest, a pause that could mean anything. This, right here, is where it all happened. Not in the sagas or carved runestones, but in these moments of fumbling closeness, of unsure hands and soft laughter. Tonight, we're talking about intimacy, not the epic, not the cursed or prophetic, just the human. Because for all the fierce poetry and grand betrayals and rune-inscribed seductions, most Viking love happened in the quiet. It was awkward, messy, sometimes passionate, sometimes hilarious, and it usually took place on straw mattresses that reeked faintly of livestock. Welcome to the real bedroom stories of Norse society. So let's get specific. A typical Viking sleeping arrangement? You're on a bench, or if you're lucky, a bed box built into the side of the longhouse wall. These weren't private rooms, more like curtained alcoves, if even that. If the couple had a bit of status, they might have a space screened off with cloth or wooden partitions. Otherwise, they were right there in the mix, separated only by the universal agreement to pretend no one heard anything. People just got used to it. The squeak of a bed frame, a muffled gasp, the slow rhythm of shared breath. It wasn't scandalous. It was just life. But even in these conditions, there was tenderness. Historical evidence suggests that Viking couples, especially long-term ones, often shared emotional as well as physical closeness. One poem describes a husband and wife waking together, her hand curled beneath his chin, the firelight just starting to glow. Another tells of a woman braiding her man's hair in the morning before battle, murmuring blessings under her breath. Not passion exactly, something quieter, something built over time. When it came to sex, Viking attitudes were surprisingly flexible. While there were clear rules about when and with whom one could sleep, the act itself wasn't loaded with the kind of shame later Christian Europe would slap on it. Sex was part of life, necessary, enjoyable, even worth writing about sometimes. And people didn't mind talking about it, so long as it was done in the right company, and preferably with some clever metaphor. There were expectations, of course. Husbands were supposed to satisfy their wives, not out of love necessarily, but out of honour and responsibility. If a wife complained publicly that her husband couldn't perform or wasn't attentive, it damaged his reputation, not hers, his. Impotence was a cultural fear. A man unable to please a woman was seen as weak, perhaps even cursed. There are sagas where this leads to duels, lawsuits, even social exile. One guy was reportedly mocked with a carved wooden statue shaped like a certain very specific male feature. And let's just say, it was not flattering. And women? They had expectations too. A wife was supposed to be sexually available to her husband, but also not overly eager, lest she seem unseemly. But in private, there's strong evidence that women were allowed, if not expected, to enjoy sex. Some poems, especially those told from a woman's point of view, speak openly about desire, about pleasure, even about frustration when the man falls short, literally or figuratively. One skaldic verse, likely composed by a woman, jokingly mocks a young man for being all confidence and no skill. Another describes a woman laughing as her lover accidentally rips her tunic in haste. There's no shame in these verses, no moralizing, just the age-old comedy of bodies trying, and sometimes failing to fit together comfortably. Of course, intimacy wasn't always consensual. Let's not sugarcoat it. Viking society, like most ancient cultures, had deeply uneven power dynamics. Slaves, especially female thralls, had little or no ability to refuse their masters. These encounters, often hidden in euphemistic saga language, were part of daily life, and the emotional toll they took was rarely, if ever, mentioned. Some female slaves were taken as unofficial wives or concubines, others as disposable objects, and while certain relationships might have developed genuine affection over time, the starting point was still coercion. That's not romantic. That's structural violence. On the flip side, there are rare cases where high-status women initiated relationships with lower-status men or even servants. These situations were scandalous, not because of the sex, but because of the reversal of power. A chieftain's wife caught with a shepherd wasn't just humiliating to the household, it was politically destabilizing. That didn't stop it from happening. People are people, but it did mean serious consequences if the affair became public. Now here's a fringe detail you probably weren't expecting. Archaeologists have uncovered Viking-age artifacts that might have been used as, let's say, bedroom enhancements. Smooth phallic-shaped stones, bone carvings, and even one soapstone object with very specific curves and handle placement. Nothing's confirmed, of course. Maybe it was just an oddly shaped pestle. But when you find it hidden beneath a floorboard, next to personal jewellery and a love charm, let's just say, sometimes a stone isn't just a stone. So what did good intimacy look like in Viking culture? There's no handbook, but clues suggest it included mutual enjoyment, some emotional closeness, and, if you were lucky, a shared sense of humour. Some couples stayed together for life, not because they had to, but because it worked. Others divorced and remarried without scandal, and some had long, quiet affairs that never made it into the sagas, but were no less real for that. Modern scholars are still teasing apart the strands. Some argue that intimacy was largely functional, meant for reproduction, inheritance, and alliances. Others see the emotional undertones in poems and legal texts as proof that love, or at least affection, played a bigger role than we give it credit for. The truth? Probably both. Vikings were practical people. But that didn't mean they were unfeeling. So tonight, as the embers die and the hush deepens, you imagine two people tangled under furs, sharing warmth in a house too cold and a world too dangerous to go it alone. Maybe they're in love, maybe it's just a moment, but it matters, because this flicker of shared breath in the dark, is what kept people human, even when the rest of the world was sharpening axes. And next we'll move from quiet beds to louder bonds, the ties of kinship, fostering and chosen family. Because not all Viking love was romantic. Some of it was loyalty written in blood. The morning light slips through the smoke hole, pale and sluggish, casting soft beams across fur-wrapped bodies and heavy timber walls. The longhouse stirs, not all at once, but in waves. Someone starts the fire again, someone feeds the animals, someone stumbles outside to answer nature's call with visible reluctance. It's an ordinary morning in Viking life, except for what lingers in the background. A child's giggle, a brother's hand clapping another's shoulder, a shared mug passed around with a grunt that means, you're part of this. Love, once again, shows up where you're not looking for it. Because tonight, we're looking beyond romance and sex to the quieter, enduring forms of Viking affection, kinship, fostering and chosen family. Because here's the thing, the Vikings didn't just fall in love, they built bonds, thick, tangled, political, emotional bonds that held entire communities together. And in a world where survival was never guaranteed and affection often had to live behind function, these bonds were love. Love in the form of loyalty, protection, sacrifice. And sometimes, the kind of care that didn't need to say its name out loud. Start with the blood ties. Family was everything. Your lineage, your rieto, was your identity, your honour, your resume. And yet, being part of the same bloodline didn't guarantee affection. Plenty of sagas are filled with brothers betraying brothers, fathers disowning sons, mothers plotting vengeance over long-held slights. But when it worked, it was unshakable. A son avenging a slain father wasn't just obeying duty, it was expressing love in the language of steel. A sister hiding her outlawed brother in the barn. That was care, in a world where care could get you killed. And a mother tearing into a chieftain for dishonouring her daughter. That wasn't just fury, that was a visceral, aching defence of someone she'd once carried inside her. You didn't say, I love you in Old Norse. You showed it. Loudly. With blood if necessary. But beyond blood, there was fostering. And that's where things get interesting. Viking children, especially of noble or warrior status, were often sent to be raised in other households. Not because their parents didn't love them, but because these arrangements created lasting alliances. You raise my son, I raise yours. Our families become intertwined. The foster bond, in many ways, could be stronger than the biological one. Foster brothers and sisters often had deeper loyalty than real siblings. They'd grown up together, survived awkward teenage years, trained, hunted, sometimes even fought side by side, and when the time came, they'd die for each other. One of the most moving examples comes from Njal's saga, which, let's be honest, might as well be called Everyone Dies but Feelings First. In it, foster brothers Thorhall and Skarfedin share a loyalty so intense it bends the plot around them. Even as blood feuds rage and logic fails, their connection holds. It's not romantic, it's not sweet, it's fierce. And in Viking culture, that counted for a lot. The same applies to oath brothers, men who weren't related by blood but swore loyalty to each other through ritual. Some scholars have debated whether these relationships had a romantic or sexual dimension. Some probably did, others didn't need that to be intense. Oath brothers might share property, raise each other's children, or go to war together with no expectation of repayment. When one died, the other mourned as if he'd lost a part of his own body. And sometimes he had. Even more fascinating, the role of chosen family in outlaw culture. Once someone was fjarlaus, or outlawed, stripped of their legal rights, they relied entirely on those who loved them by choice, not obligation. Friends who hid them, brought them food, carried messages, lied for them. These people didn't gain anything from the bond. No inheritance, no political power, just loyalty. And in a society built on mutual obligation, this was radical. There's a lesser-known story of a woman who continued to care for her outlawed lover for years, never seeing him, never speaking, just leaving supplies in a hollow tree. No one ever caught her. When he was finally pardoned and returned, they didn't marry, they didn't even move in together. They simply sat beside the fire one night and passed a cup of ale in silence. That was all. That was enough. Now here's your fringe fact for the night. There's evidence that Vikings sometimes formalised these bonds through rituals involving shared blood or symbolic marriage, exchanging knives, mixing wine with blood, or swearing oaths over stones. These weren't necessarily romantic gestures, but they were intimate, powerful, meant to last. A reminder that family could be forged, not just born. And among women? Oh, the bonds were fierce. Saga after saga tells of female friendships that outlasted marriages, outwitted war, and occasionally manipulated entire households. Women ran longhouses together, managed farms while the men were raiding, raised children not their own. One saga describes two women, widows, who choose to live together rather than remarry. It's not called romantic, but it's called enough. Modern scholars often hesitate to label these relationships. Were they platonic, romantic, queer? The truth is, Viking society didn't box intimacy into categories the way we do. A bond could be emotional, physical, practical, sacred, or all of the above. And because language was limited, because you didn't have a dozen words for affection, you just lived it. In actions, in ritual, in who you'd fight for when everything fell apart. And yes, sometimes love meant leaving, exiling yourself from a clan you no longer trusted, refusing to marry for alliance, choosing the friend over the father. These acts didn't look like love, but they were. So tonight, as you sit with this fire and watch these imagined families take shape in the flicker and smoke, you realise how much was built not on desire, but on endurance, on familiarity, on standing shoulder to shoulder even when the world turned cold. And next, we trace what happens when love tries to survive change. Because as the Viking Age ends and new beliefs creep in, what happens to love, to sex, and to the stories we're allowed to tell? You're standing at the edge of something now, not a forest, not a field, but a feeling. Behind you, the rough familiarity of the old world, longhouses, runes, blood oaths and firelit sagas. In front of you, a church. Stone walls, cold and clean. A bell that doesn't belong here chimes in the distance, and it's the first sound you've heard in a long time that doesn't carry wood smoke or wolf howl in its bones. The Viking world is changing. And love, messy, fierce, sweaty, sacred Viking love, is about to be rewritten by men in robes. Tonight we trace what happened to intimacy, romance and sex as Norse paganism gave way to Christianity. Because when the gods went quiet and the crosses went up, everything had to shift. What was allowed, what was holy, what was shameful and what was just, erased. It didn't happen all at once. Christian missionaries had been poking around for centuries before things really took hold. Kings converted strategically, trading gods for political favours and silver crosses. Laws started to echo church values, slowly, carefully, but unmistakably. And in the meantime, the people kept doing what they'd always done, getting married, having affairs, sneaking into the woods, carving rude poems into fence posts. But they knew change was coming, and so did the stories. One of the first things to be rebranded? Sex. In the old ways, sex was just life. Powerful, sacred, disruptive, sometimes funny, sometimes tragic, but never inherently sinful. The gods themselves weren't shy about it. Odin slept his way across the cosmos. Freya's necklace was famously earned through 4 nights with 4 dwarves, arguably one of the more metal-sounding hookups in mythology. Loki had children with a giantess, and also, depending on how closely you read the Eddas, may have turned into a mare and birthed a horse. Don't ask. The point is, sex wasn't dirty. It could be dangerous, sure, politically loaded, spiritually charged, but it wasn't something to be hidden in shame. And then came the priests. Christianity introduced a whole new framework, one where sex was suspect unless it served a purpose, namely, producing children within a church-sanctioned marriage. Desire for its own sake? Sinful. Premarital sex? Absolutely sinful. Adultery? Don't even start. Suddenly the kinds of relationships the Viking world had tolerated, lovers outside of wedlock, informal partnerships, concubinage, same-sex intimacy, even just casual flings, were condemned. Legal codes began to shift. In the early Christian-era laws of Iceland and Norway, we see increased penalties for fornication, stricter divorce laws, and a general push toward monogamy and marital control. The Gragas, the Icelandic law book, starts sounding a lot less like a saga and more like a sermon. You can almost hear the parchment sighing under the weight of judgment. And love magic? Forget it. What had once been playful, powerful, or even sacred suddenly became heresy. Casting a love spell was rebranded as witchcraft. Using runes to stir desire was a fast track to suspicion, especially for women. The vulva, once a revered figure, became a threat, a target. By the 12th century she was less a wise woman and more a dangerous sorceress. And we all know how that ends in later European history. But here's the thing, people didn't just forget. They didn't suddenly stop wanting, feeling, needing. The church might have tried to reshape the narrative, but the old stories lingered. They slipped into folklore, into lullabies, into the margins of manuscripts. The sagas, many written down during or after Christianization, still pulse with pre-Christian energy. You can feel it in how they treat fate, how they handle marriage, how they describe the heat between characters with too much longing and too little opportunity. Some scholars argue that the Christian-era saga writers were intentionally preserving these older themes, even as they had to coat them in acceptably moral endings. Lovers still meet in secret, wives still outsmart their husbands, warriors still pine for people they're not allowed to touch. The difference. Now there's usually a comeuppance, a punishment, a price. The stories start to warn instead of witness. Even marriage itself changed. The Christian church made it a sacrament, not contract. That sounds nice, sure, but it also meant less flexibility. Divorce, once relatively accessible in pagan society, became difficult, even forbidden. Women lost the legal rights they'd once had to walk away. And the men? They lost the social permission to maintain multiple relationships or informal households. Not that it stopped everyone, it just made the guilt official. And yet, even in this colder, narrower world, love kept finding cracks to grow through. People wrote new kinds of poetry, more pious, more delicate, but still aching. Courtly love, imported from the continent, began to mix with the rawer Norse traditions. Suddenly you had knights writing about their ladies' eyes while still vaguely remembering their grandfather had seduced someone using a carved fishhook and a smirk. And in the quieter corners of the new faith, something else took root. Spiritual intimacy. You start to see accounts of married couples who chose celibacy together. People who expressed their affection through shared devotion, mutual service, prayer. It wasn't about suppression, it was about redirection. A different kind of love, not better, just changed. Here's your fringe fact for tonight. One medieval Scandinavian cleric, clearly struggling with his own temptations, wrote a whole confession in the margins of a psalter, admitting he still dreamed of the old gods, and of the woman with golden hair who used to sing at the river. Whether she was real or myth, he missed her. He carried her like a ghost. Even with Christ in his head, Freya still lingered in his heart. So what do scholars say? Some see Christianization as a tragic erasure of a freer, more complex emotional culture. Others argue it brought structure, moral clarity, a sense of sanctity to love. Both can be true. What matters is that people kept feeling. They adapted. They smuggled their desires across the border between gods. They told the same old stories with new endings, and sometimes they let the old endings sneak back in when no one was looking. So tonight, as you stand outside that stone church and hear the faint echo of a saga in your ears, you understand. Viking love didn't disappear. It went underground. Into the stories, into the songs, into the stolen glances behind a priest's back. And in that tension, between what was and what was allowed, you find something more powerful than either, survival. Next, we'll draw this long, strange, beautifully messy journey to a close, gathering all the threads, the passion and pain, the honour and horniness, and tucking them in with care. Because even the fiercest loves deserve a soft ending. The end of the story always sneaks up on you. One moment you're knee-deep in drama, stolen brides, whispered poetry, love spells buried under doorsteps, and the next, you're looking back, realising just how far you've come. Tonight you stand at the threshold of memory, torch in hand, watching the flickering shadows of all the love, sex, loyalty, betrayal, and heartbreak that shaped the Viking world. And what you see is this. The dark truth about intimacy in Norse society isn't just that it was messy or brutal, it's that it was real, complicated, sacred in its own way, and still echoing through time. Let's walk through those echoes one last time. You remember the longhouses, cramped and firelit, where privacy was a joke, but intimacy still managed to survive, where lovers shared stolen moments beneath rough-woven blankets, and where every sigh could be overheard by half the household, yet meant more for it. That was love as necessity, as defiance, as daily habit. Then there were the arranged marriages, contracts carved in goat hide and sealed with ale, but even those could bloom into affection or rot into resentment. Marriages where livestock changed hands, sure, but also where people made quiet pacts not to destroy each other. Sometimes that was the best you could hope for. Sometimes it was enough. You saw how women navigated these tight spaces, powerful in their own ways, using law, wit, and sometimes spells to claim what was theirs. Women who divorced their husbands in public, women who avenged lovers with blood, women who loved other women in whispers and glances and berry-picking silences. There's no saga that names it, but the emotion lingers, stubborn and soft. And yes, there was violence. Love and sex in the Viking world weren't always consensual or kind. Slavery twisted intimacy into power plays. War made trophies out of people, and not everyone who loved got to do it safely, or openly. That's part of the truth too. But there was tenderness, even in a world built on steel, in runes carved on stones no one else was meant to read, in poems left at the edges of sagas like forgotten tears, in rituals that tied two people together with fire, mead, and the murmur of gods that were already starting to fade. You followed lovers into the ground, literally, shared graves, grave goods, gestures of memory that spoke of bonds deeper than just alliance. Bones don't lie. And sometimes they tell stories no law ever allowed. You wandered the woods, that secret underworld of Viking intimacy, where trysts bloomed among moss and roots, where love didn't need permission to exist, where rituals were held for gods who were more interested in feeling than in doctrine. And then came the shifts, the seers who used ecstasy as prophecy, who danced on the edges of the divine with love tangled in their spells, the queer echoes in oaths and poems and forgotten verses, the sagas that said everything and nothing about the bonds that mattered most, the scholars still debating what it all really meant, while the stories sit there smirking like they know you'll never quite figure them out. Then the churches came, crosses rising like stone verdicts, and the messy, ungovernable sprawl of Viking desire was slowly measured, boxed, and judged. But even then, especially then, love found ways to survive, in silence, in sin, in secret. Now here's your last fringe fact. A small hand-carved comb was found in a grave in Sweden. It bore no name, just a short phrase in runes, almost too worn to read. When translated, it said, "For the one who touched my heart." That's it. No saga attached, no footnote, just a personal artifact buried with care. Love, preserved in wood and dirt, where no one was ever meant to see it. But someone still wrote it down. And modern historians, they're still pulling at the threads. Some see a world ruled by hierarchy and power, where sex was transaction and marriage was math. Others argue that even within those systems, people carved out space for feeling. They laughed, they cried, they reached for each other in the dark. The truth isn't either or, it's both and, just like today. Because that's the thing. For all the swords and sleds and rune stones, Vikings weren't all that different from us. They wanted connection. They wanted meaning. They wanted someone to choose them, across the feasting bench beneath the stars or in the afterlife. So tonight, as you close this journey, you carry with you not just the history, but the heartbeat beneath it. The truth that love doesn't need perfect conditions to matter. It just needs people willing to feel it, to fight for it, or sometimes to let it go. Next, we take a breath. We wind down, we let the echoes rest. Because the story's been told, the saga has ended, and your mind deserves a soft landing. And now, you're back where you started. The fire's gone out, just a ring of soft grey ash. The longhouse is quiet, the forest is still, the runes are unread but somehow understood. You've travelled across centuries, through the heat of secret lovers' meetings, into the cold logic of clan politics, down to the buried hush of shared graves. You've heard the laughter between firs, the footsteps slipping into woods, the clatter of a drinking horn dropped after a whispered confession. And now it's time to let it all settle. Let your body sink. Let the weight of the story lift. Maybe you expected the Vikings to be all axes and testosterone, raiding and pillaging with nothing but grunts and curses, but now you know. The truth is stranger, softer, harder, sweeter, and messier than the myths. They didn't write love poems in the modern sense, but they lived them in the pauses between laws, in the heat under bear pelts, in the glances that never made it into the sagas. They had love that was practical, love that was painful, love that defied their gods, their rules, and even their sense of honour. They carved it into wood, they buried it with their dead, they dreamed it through prophecy, nursed it in silence, and sometimes, even when they shouldn't have, they chose it over everything else. And you? You made it through, you sat with it, you learned, you questioned, you followed the path into places most people never even think to look. Not everyone wants to hear that Viking love was real and complicated and sometimes cruel, but you did. So as you lie there, limbs loose, the dark pressing in gentle and cool, let your breath slow, let your mind drift just a little. There's nothing left to figure out, nothing to chase, just this feeling, this knowing that even in a time of blades and thunder, hearts still beat. They beat for lovers, for friends, for chosen family, for fleeting touches under storm-heavy skies. Dim the lights, keep that fan going for a little background hum, and let yourself rest, knowing that the truth is always deeper than the story. And stories, well, the good ones never really end.